Rain still clings to the marble ruins of Knossos, glittering in the lamplight of modern archaeologists who brush dust from the eyes of long-dead kings. Beneath that sheen of time, something ancient hums a rhythm of power, of dynasty, of names lost to both myth and memory. Before Athens dreamed of democracy, before Sparta drilled its boys to kill, there were the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, two civilizations whose empires rose and fell in silence, leaving only fragments to whisper their truths. The Greek dynasties did not begin with marble temples or painted philosophers. They began with storms, with trade with gods that demanded blood and song. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Maybe we're connected by history and moonlight both. So close your eyes for a moment and imagine Crete around 2000 BCE. The sea glows like molten glass. Ships slide out of the harbor, their sails fat with wind carrying oil grain and gossip. The Minoan kings, or rather priest kings, ruled not with iron, but with elegance. They built palaces without walls, confident their sea would protect them. Their throne rooms shimmered with frescoes, blue dolphins, white lilies, golden robes, and beneath those colors pulsed a civilization so peaceful that it worshipped the bull, not the sword. Knossos Phaistos, Malia, all centers of ceremony and commerce, were the first experiments in organized Greek rulership. No one can say for sure if the Minoans had dynasties in the way we understand them. Perhaps their power passed through queens, perhaps through priestly bloodlines, perhaps through a council masked by ritual. But even then, the dream of inheritance was already there. The idea that order and lineage could bend chaos into beauty. Yet beauty never lasts without balance. Around 1450 BCE, something shifted. Fire spread through Crete's palaces. Pottery shattered, frescoes blackened, and a new people from the mainland began to appear, the Mycenaeans. They were cousins perhaps, but harder, sterner, raised in stone citadels where bronze echoed against shields. If the Minoans had ruled by persuasion, the Mycenaeans ruled by spear point. Their kings called themselves one-axe great lords in a network of palaces from Mycenae to Pylos, from Tiryns to Thebes. They wrote in Linear B, the first known Greek script, and their tablets record a bureaucracy so detailed it could have rivaled later empires. There was Agamemnon of legend, sitting on his golden throne, and others whose names we know only through fragments, Enchedon, Equash, Eteoclewes. Their tombs yawned with wealth, masks of hammered gold covering faces that have long since turned to dust. But as always, myth blends with fact, until neither can be told apart. The poets would later remember these men as half-gods, their wars immortalized in Homer's verse. Whether the Trojan War truly happened or was just a memory of Mycenaean raiding is a question that keeps historians awake even now. What is certain is that these kings, these early dynasts of Greece, built something vast, complex, and brittle. The more they reached for glory, the closer they came to shattering it. Around 1200 BCE, palaces began to fall. One after another, their records burn, their trade collapses. Some blame invaders, the mysterious sea peoples. Others, internal revolt, drought, or even an earthquake that broke the fragile network of Bronze Age prosperity. Whatever the cause, Mycenae's great halls fell silent, and with them, the first dynasties of Greece. The concept of kingship did not vanish, but it dimmed as though the gods had turned their faces away. What followed was an age without written language, without great monuments, without certainty, a dark age in which memory itself seemed to sleep. And yet the embers of lineage still glowed. In villages scattered across the hills, elders told stories of the heroes who once ruled. They spoke of men who sailed to Troy, of palaces glittering like sons of gods, who mingled with mortals and punished pride. These were not mere bedtime tales. They were genealogies in disguised threads of memory preserving the idea of dynastic order. Even when the palaces crumbled, Greece's fascination with noble birth, with inherited virtue, survived in its myths. Achilles, Odysseus, and Agamemnon were remembered not just as warriors, but as heirs to divine right, a motif that would echo through every age of Greek history. As time softened, those ruined seeds of new power began to stir in the soil. Around 900 BCE, small communities began to gather again. Farmers, traders, and warriors built stone temples and offered sacrifices to the same gods their ancestors once feared. These humble beginnings would give rise to the city-states, the polis that would dominate the next 1,000 years. But before Athens, before Sparta, before the marble and the columns, there was the memory of Knossos and Mycenae, of kings who ruled by will and wonder, of dynasties that believed themselves chosen by the heavens. When dawn finally returned to the Aegean, it came not as a blaze of glory, but as a quiet rekindling of light among ruins. The Bronze Age kings were gone, their palaces swallowed by vines and myth, yet their memory persisted in the bones of the land. Across rocky hills and olive groves, the descendants of those forgotten rulers rebuilt not in gold and limestone this time, but in humble clay and stone, each hearth a small echo of lost grandeur. The Bronze Age had not ended so much as transformed, breaking the idea of absolute power and scattering it like shards across the Greek world. And slowly, those shards began to glimmer again. In the 14th century BCE, the walls of Mycenae had seemed eternal blocks so massive that later Greeks would believe only Cyclopes could have lifted them. Behind those walls, dynasties had flourished under kings whose names passed like smoke through linear B tablets, the Wanaks of Mycenae, the Lauagetas of Pylos, the administrators of Thebes. Each palace functioned as a miniature empire, balancing tribute trade and war. The Mycenaeans borrowed from the Minoans' beauty, but added their own austere order, favoring fortresses over frescoes. It was as if two halves of the Greek psyche had taken turns at creation. First the dreamers of Crete, then the warriors of the mainland. But it is always easier to build walls than to hold what's inside them. The Bronze Age kings built too many. They overextended their networks, drained their lands, and trusted too deeply in their gods' favor. When famine, earthquake, and invasion converged, those fortresses became tombs. The collapse of Mycenae around 1200 BCE ended a pattern of centralized rule that had lasted centuries. For nearly 300 years after Greece drifted into the so-called Dark Age, a period not of total oblivion, but of profound simplification. Imagine the silence. Linear B vanished, writing itself disappeared. Pottery grew, plain trade routes withered, and palaces were replaced by huts. Yet within this apparent void, something extraordinary was happening. Oral tradition, freed from the rigidity of bureaucracy, began to flourish. Bards wandered from village to village, singing of fallen kings, heroic dynasties, and divine retribution. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not written then, But their foundations were laid in these campfire retellings of ancestral glory. Through song, the concept of noble lineage survived. As centuries passed, small communities began to gather around strong families once more. Chiefs basileis replaced wanaxes. They were local lords, often both priests and warriors, whose power depended on charisma as much as inheritance. Their dynasties were fragile, yet they formed the bridge between the mythic kings of Mycenae and the historical rulers to come. By the 9th century, BCE, new patterns of hierarchy emerged: clan heads, councils of elders, and assemblies that foreshadowed the later Greek polis. Somewhere in these centuries of quiet rebuilding, iron replaced bronze. The new metal was harder, cheaper, and more democratic. Every man could wield a sword, now not just nobles with distant ties to a palace. Warfare itself became a leveling force, and with it, the first murmurs of citizenship began to stir. Yet even as equality whispered from the anvil, memory longed for the certainty of kingship. You can almost feel that tension pulsing beneath the soil, the dream of shared rule pressing against the nostalgia for dynastic glory. Archaeologists have traced the faint revival through pottery styles, the geometric precision of vases from Dipylon and Lefkandi. One grave, then known as the Haroun of Lefkandi, reveals a man and woman buried together with horses and gold. Their tomb, built centuries after the fall of Mycenae, echoes royal customs of old. Were they local rulers or simply the last who remembered how to bury a king? Either way, the act itself speaks of continuity. The Greek world was relearning how to honor power. By the 8th century BCE, the stage was set for something new. Population grew, trade revived, and writing returned, this time borrowed from the Phoenicians. With letters came law, and with law came order. Cities began to form around natural harbors and defensible hills. Each was independent, self-governing, and proud, yet all were haunted by the same ancestral memory: the rise and fall of dynasties. To avoid that fate, they sought balance between kings and councils, between myth and pragmatism. In Homer's poems, which crystallized around this time, you can hear the echo of that balance. His heroes are kings, yes, but their authority is never absolute. Agamemnon quarrels with Achilles and loses his army's respect. Odysseus rules Ithaca, but must rely on wit, not divine right. Homer's Greece is still aristocratic, still steeped in the scent of lineage, but it has begun to question the cost of power. His audience, farmers, sailors, craftsmen, knew all too well that the age of bronze-masked kings had ended in fire. Their own world needed new rules, and yet it is fascinating how myth filled the gaps that history left empty. The Greeks could not name the real founders of their cities, so they invented them: Cecrops of Athens, Cadmus; of Thebes, Minyas; of Orchomenos. Each was said to have sprung from the soil or descended from gods, a symbolic attempt to root human authority in divine origin. The storytelling served a purpose. It connected scattered communities to a common heroic past. Dynasties became metaphors, not just lineages. Meanwhile, beyond the Aegean, other civilizations rose and fell: Assyria in Mesopotamia, the Kushites in Egypt. But Greece, in its fragmented isolation, was shaping something subtler: the idea that identity could outlast empire. Even as their ancestors' palaces lay in ruin, the Greeks were building an empire of memory. They learned to revere heroes more than king's city, founders more than conquerors. From this reversal grew the seeds of a civilization unlike any before. As you rest your mind on that image, smoke rising from hearths, songs traveling through dark hills, iron blades glinting under the first returning stars. Remember how cyclical human history is. Power collapses, memory fades, and yet in the silence afterward, people always begin again. The Bronze Age kings of Greece are gone, but their legacy lingers in the cadence of every Greek name, every marble column, every whispered myth. The dynasties of stone fell, but the dynasty of spirit endured. The silence that followed the fall of Mycenae was not the silence of death, but of deep transformation. The long inhale before a civilization learned to breathe again. Across the scattered islands and valleys, Greece became a tapestry of isolated villages, each ruled by a small chieftain, surrounded by kin and loyal retainers. The palatial bureaucracies were gone. In their place grew households of endurance and memory, their walls low, but their pride unbroken. They had no scribes, no accountants, no royal messengers, only oral tradition, and the stubborn human need to belong to a lineage. For nearly 3 centuries, this was Greece, a network of memories bound by blood and song. It's strange to think of how darkness can sometimes protect light. During this Greek Dark Age, art shrank to essential circles, triangles, meanders painted on pottery. But within those simple lines was a rhythm, an order, a quiet precision that hinted at a reawakening. Archaeologists have found small bronze figurines of horses and men offered at hilltop shrines, proof that even in hardship, the Greeks never stopped invoking the gods of their ancestors. Kingship persisted, though shrunken. The Basileus ruled by persuasion and example, not decree. He led in war, presided over sacrifices, and judged disputes, but his word could be challenged by councils of elders. It was monarchy tempered by memory, a faint echo of the great dynasties that once were. Somewhere among those faint echoes, oral poets began weaving the past into grandeur again. The names of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus grew brighter the further they drifted from truth. Homer's eventual masterpiece, composed perhaps in the 8th century BCE, was less history than resurrection. In his verses, the Bronze Age kings regained their gold and fury. His audience, huddled in simple huts, listened and felt noble once more. For the first time, the people of Greece could imagine themselves as heirs to something vast. They were poor, yes, but descended from greatness. And that belief, that memory itself could confer nobility, became one of the most potent dynasties Greece would ever know. As the Dark Age waned, trade crept back across the Aegean. Phoenician ships appeared on the horizon, bringing purple dye fine goods, and most importantly, a system of writing. The Greeks borrowed it eagerly, bending the Phoenician script into something suited to their own sounds. With that language returned to stone and clay, and a new age began to shimmer on the horizon, the Archaic Age. Greece was learning once again how to record its own destiny. In this rebirth, the land itself seemed to remember. Old hilltop ruins, like Mycenae and Tiryns, became places of pilgrimage. The descendants of those once great dynasties built small sanctuaries among the fallen stones, linking themselves symbolically to the heroes of the past. This reverence for ancestry gave rise to the concept of hero cults. Kings of legend became intercessors between gods and men. Achilles had his mound by the Hellespont, Agamemnon his tomb at Mycenae, Theseus his shrine in Athens. Worshipping these figures was not idolatry. It was lineage worship, the spiritual continuation of dynastic reverence. But for all the beauty of this nostalgia, a quiet shift was happening underneath. The Greeks were beginning to value not only inheritance, but participation. The warrior assemblies that advised their chieftains grew in confidence, and soon decisions were made collectively by the men of the community. Small stone walls were raised around hilltops, and within them markets formed, temples grew, and laws were spoken aloud before the people. The polis, the city-state, was being born, though none of its citizens yet understood how revolutionary that birth would be. As new cities emerged, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, they often claimed divine founders to legitimize their beginnings. In Attica, the Athenians told of Cecrops, half-man, half-serpent, who first taught them marriage and burial rites. Later came Theseus, who united the scattered villages into one city. In Thebes, they revered Cadmus, who slew the dragon and sowed its teeth to birth noble warriors. Every story, no matter how fantastic, served a civic purpose. It made the city feel ancient, rooted in mythic continuity. A dynasty might be lost, but its symbolic power could be reborn as civic pride. Even the ruins of Mycenaean citadels were reinterpreted as Cyclopean, said to have been built by giants. The Greeks, humbled by the loss of their Bronze Age ancestors, found comfort in believing that the old kings had been almost superhuman. This act of myth-making was more than self-flattery. It was a way to frame their own rise as destiny. History had not abandoned Greece. It had merely been testing her. Yet beneath this flowering of identity lay questions that would trouble Greece forever. Who should rule? What gave a man the right to power, bloodline strength, wisdom, or divine favor? Each city would answer differently, and their answers would shape the coming centuries of rivalry and brilliance. Sparta clung to dual kingship, a relic of heroic ancestry. Athens began to experiment with councils and codified law. Corinth, rich in trade, oscillated between oligarchy and tyranny. And in this shifting landscape, dynasties reappeared, not in palaces, but in families who learned to hold power within the framework of the polis. The Bacchiads in Corinth, the Agiads and Eurypontids in Sparta, the Alcmaeonids in Athens, all traced their bloodlines back to mythical founders. They ruled not as despots, but as custodians of tradition. Greek civilization was modernizing, but it still carried its old obsession with lineage, like a charm against chaos. The light returns more confidently, now shimmering over the Aegean like a promise kept. Villages have grown into towns. The scattered kin groups of the Dark Age have fused into the first polis, the city-states. Their walls rise in rough limestone, their marketplaces chatter with barter and debate, and their temples smell of olive oil and burnt offering. The gods have come home, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, each claiming dominion over a city and its people. What had once been wandering tribes now pulse with the beginnings of organized life. The age of kings has softened into the age of the polis, and yet beneath the marble dust and the market noise, the old dynastic blood still flows. The polis was not just a place. It was an idea, perhaps the most revolutionary idea Greece ever gave the world. It suggested that a community could be bound not only by lineage, but by choice, by shared law and shared worship. Yet this shift did not happen overnight, nor did it erase the ghosts of kingship. The early city-states were still ruled by basileis, local monarchs, whose thrones rested on ancestral right. These kings led in war, offered sacrifices to the gods, and presided over justice. But now, for the first time, their authority was questioned by those who stood beside them in battle. Aristocratic councils emerged assemblies of elders and warriors, often composed of the king's kin or rivals. The idea of collective decision-making began to nibble at the roots of divine rule. In this fragile balance between monarchy and council lay the seed of both democracy and tyranny. The Greek city-states were laboratories of power, each experimenting in its own way. Some leaned toward hereditary rule, others toward oligarchy, a few, though still rare, toward proto-democratic assemblies. What united them all was a shared anxiety, how to preserve order without suffocating freedom. Athens, even in these early centuries, shimmered with peculiar restlessness. The kings of Attica traced their lineage to semi-mythical figures: Cecrops, the serpent man; Erechtheus, the earthborn; Theseus, the unifier of tribes. These were not mere stories. They were political foundations, justifications for rule. The Athenians believed that their land had never been conquered, that they were autochthonous, sprung from the soil itself. It was a comforting myth, suggesting that no invader, not even time, could sever their bond to their homeland. Their kings, though sacred, were mortal caretakers of this eternal birthright. Far to the south, on the plains of Laconia, Sparta was taking a very different path. Here the memory of dynasties became literal. The Spartans preserved not one, but two royal houses, the Argeads and the Eurypontids, claiming descent from twin sons of Heracles himself. Two kings ruled simultaneously, balancing each other like mirrored shields. It was an ingenious system, born from both superstition and practicality. Dual kingship prevented tyranny, preserved lineage, and allowed one king to lead in war while the other remained to govern. Beneath them, a council of elders. The Gerousia checked royal power, while an assembly of citizens shouted their approval or disapproval. Sparta, even in its infancy, had discovered a form of controlled harmony. Dynasty fused with discipline. Corinth, meanwhile, thrived as a hub of trade. Its rulers, the Bacchiad family, turned hereditary power into corporate aristocracy. They married within their clan, monopolized magistracies, and adorned their city with temples to Poseidon and Aphrodite. But where there is monopoly, envy follows. In time, Corinth's prosperity bred resentment, and the seeds of tyranny would soon sprout there too. Across the sea on Euboea, and in the islands of the Cyclades, other city-states grew restless as well. They built ships, ventured to Italy, Sicily, and the Black Sea, founding colonies that would spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean. These colonies were often led by oikists, founders granted near-divine status, establishing new dynastic lines abroad, even as the homeland struggled with equality. Thus, the paradox deepened. The Greeks dismantled monarchy at home, but exported it everywhere else. The 8th and 7th centuries BCE were centuries of awakening, yet also of unease. Population boomed, farmland grew scarce, and the gap between rich and poor widened. The aristocrats who had replaced kingship often proved no less greedy. Their wealth came from land and horses, their power from lineage, and their arrogance from the conviction that the gods favored them. The common citizens, farmers, hoplites, craftsmen, began to chafe under their rule. In Athens, this tension would eventually birth democracy. In other cities, it would birth tyrants. The word tyrannos did not yet mean what it does today. In early Greece, a tyrant was simply a man who seized power outside the traditional hereditary system. Some were despots, yes, but others were reformers, leaders who broke the grip of entrenched aristocracies. The coming of tyranny would shake Greece to its core, forcing it to decide what kind of power it truly valued. But that storm still lay ahead. For now, the city-states hummed with possibility. Culturally, this was the era when Greece found its rhythm again. The Olympic Games were born binding city-states in friendly rivalry. Poets like Hesiod began writing not of kings and gods, but of farmers and justice. He spoke of the ages of man, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and of how pride and greed could corrupt even the most divine lineage. It was a warning the Greeks never quite heeded. Temples rose on every hilltop, dedicated to gods who had themselves become dynastic families: Zeus and Hera Apollo, and Artemis Poseidon and his sea-born kin. The divine mirrored the mortal. Each god ruled a domain. Each city worshipped its patron, and together they formed a celestial polis. Religion was no longer merely a private devotion. It was a statement of civic identity. To be Athenian meant to serve Athena; to be Spartan meant to honor Apollo and Artemis Orthia. And through all this, art returned. Pottery scenes grew more complex, telling stories of myth and daily life. Bronze returned not for war, but for sculpture. The human form re-emerged from abstraction, first stiff and geometric, then fluid and alive. You could almost see the Greeks remembering themselves, remembering that beauty was power, and power, when refined by thought, could outlast empires. If you listen to the pulse of the archaic age, it beats like the sea against the cliffs, steady, inevitable, patient. The city-states did not yet know they were birthing an idea that would echo across millennia. For now, they were simply learning how to live together, how to argue, how to share a lineage, not of blood, but of belonging. Morning spills across the Attic hills, gilding olive branches and marble fragments alike. The mists of prehistory have lifted, and before us stands a land awakening to self-awareness. Athens is stirring its stones, humming with memory, its people beginning to name themselves as Athenians, not merely dwellers of scattered hamlets. And like so many Greek cities, its first breath of unity is wrapped in myth, for no people ever built a nation without first building a story. Here, those stories revolve around kings half divine, half human, whose rule laid the foundations for what Athens would become. The kings of early Attica are shadows in history, but luminous in legend. Their names drift through the mist like half-remembered dreams, Cecrops who rose from the soil with a serpent's tail, Erichthonius, born of Athena's care and Hephaestus's clumsy desire, and Theseus, the slayer of the Minotaur, the unifier of the land. These figures are more than myth. They are Athens imagining its own origins, giving divine shape to human ambition. Cecrops was said to have judged between Athena and Poseidon when they contested for the city's patronage. The god of the sea offered a salt spring. The goddess of wisdom offered the olive tree. The Athenians wisely chose the tree symbol of peace, sustenance, and endurance. It's fitting that the city's first mythic decision was not about conquest, but cultivation. Beneath the story lies a quiet truth. The kings of Attica likely began as tribal chieftains, ruling small hill communities, places like Eleusis, Marathon, and Thorikos. Over time, through trade, marriage, and war, these clans coalesced under a central authority. Tradition attributes that unification. The Sinoikismos to Theseus, the hero king, who supposedly abolished the separate councils of the tribes and founded one city, one assembly, one festival, the Panathenaia. Whether Theseus truly lived or not, matters less than what he represented the moment a loose federation of families became a polity with shared destiny. Early Athens was still a monarchy, but an unusual one. Its kings or basileis ruled by ancestral right, yet were expected to embody civic virtue. They led armies, conducted sacrifices, and judged disputes, but their power was already tempered by the growing strength of aristocratic families, the Eupatridae, or well-born. The last historical king, Codrus, was said to have sacrificed himself in battle to save the city. When the invaders withdrew, awed by his selflessness, the Athenians declared that no man could ever equal his example. Thus ended their kingship. A clever legend perhaps, but an enduring one. Athens replaced its throne with an office, the archonship, rotating among noble families. It is one of history's most delicate transitions, a monarchy giving way not to tyranny, but to organized aristocracy. The Codrid line did not vanish entirely. Its descendants continued to hold priestly and judicial roles, their divine prestige still useful to a city learning to govern itself. But Athens was now guided by 9 archons, each responsible for a different sphere or religion law. Power had become procedural. The bloodline still mattered, but it was now dressed in the robes of civic duty. Elsewhere in Greece, this shift was far from universal. Sparta, as we saw, clung to its twin dynasties, while other cities toppled their kings, only to replace them with autocrats. Athens, however, began its long experiment in balance, a dance between reverence for the past and hunger for the new. Over the centuries, this tension would shape not only its government, but its entire worldview. The myths continued to anchor the people in their history. Festivals like the Panathenaia, Thargelia, and Eleusinia celebrated both gods and ancestors, binding civic identity to divine order. At Eleusis, initiates reenacted the story of Demeter and Persephone. The descent, the search, the return a ritual, mirroring the city's own cyclical rebirths. Through these ceremonies, Athens transformed memory into meaning. But aristocracy has its own perils. The Eupatridae grew rich, their estates swelling, while small farmers sank into debt. Land, not lineage, became the true measure of power. The city that once united itself under a hero's banner was now fracturing under inequality. These tensions would soon summon reformers, philosophers, and tyrants. But for now, Athens stood on a knife's edge between mythic harmony and social unrest. Still amid these quiet storms, the spirit of Athens revealed something profound, an instinct for reason. The Athenians began to question even their own legends, not to destroy them, but to understand them. They could believe that Cecrops judged between gods and still ask why they planted olives instead of waging wars. They could venerate Theseus and yet debate whether unification was just. Theirs was a city learning how to think historically about itself, and that more than any army or wall was its true inheritance. Picture it now, the Acropolis before the Parthenon. A rocky plateau crowned with a few shrines of wood and stone. Below, the agora stirs with life potters, smiths and traders shouting among the stalls. A priest leads a small procession toward Athena's temple, olive branches bound in gold. Somewhere, a young boy listens to an elder reciting the tale of Theseus. He does not know it yet, but this mingling of commerce, faith, and memory is the seed of democracy. It is the first murmur of a people who will someday vote, debate, and question everything, even the gods. The world beyond Athens hums with the same energy. In Corinth, in Argos, In Thebes, cities rise like stars across the night of history. Each invents its own form of rule, its own myth of origin, its own way of binding the living to the dead. Dynasties still breathe in these places, not through blood alone, but through memory. For every creek, the past is not gone. It is a living companion, a whisper in the wind through olive leaves. Far to the south of Attica, beyond rugged mountains and the silver-green plains of Laconia, another Greece was taking shape, stranger, sterner, and older in its heart. While Athens built its identity through stories of clever kings and divine compromise, Sparta built hers through silence, ritual, and fear. Here power was divided like a blade with two edges, two kings ruling together, each a descendant of a different divine line. To the Greeks of other cities, this arrangement seemed both fascinating and impossible. A paradox carved into stone. How could one city have two monarchs and yet no chaos? Yet for Sparta, dual kingship was its first and most enduring discipline. According to legend, the twin royal houses, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, traced their lineage back to Heracles, the lion slayer, that restless wanderer who was half god, half man. After his death, his descendants supposedly migrated south, conquering the valley of Laconia and dividing it among their heirs. Thus, the two dynasties were born, two families, both sacred bound to share rule forever. In a way, it was a dynastic compromise, a promise that no single bloodline would ever dominate the city completely. One king led the armies abroad, the other stayed to govern at home, their powers balanced by custom, fear, and the invisible hand of tradition. Sparta's earliest history is obscure, but by the 9th century BCE, it had already begun to differ from its neighbors. Where other Greek cities turned toward trade and art, Sparta turned inward. The kings ruled, but not alone. A council of elders, the Gerousia, shared authority, and beneath them, the citizen assembly voiced assent or rejection in a single shout. Later came the ephors, 5 overseers elected annually, who could even judge the kings themselves. This delicate web of power made Sparta at once rigid and strangely modern, a constitutional monarchy in an age when most cities still bent to the will of one man. Yet the foundation of all Spartan power was not politics, but fear. After conquering their neighbors, the Messenians, the Spartans transformed them into Helot state serfs, bound to the land. The ratio of Helots to citizens was enormous, and rebellion was always possible. Thus, Sparta became a fortress society, every citizen a soldier, every household an outpost of vigilance. The dual kingship, the councils, the rituals of obedience, all were designed to preserve unity in a city that could never afford division. Lycurgus, the semi-mythical lawgiver, was said to have codified this system. Whether he truly lived or was simply the name the Spartans gave to their collective memory of reform, his legend mattered more than his biography. He received the great Rhetra, the divine constitution, from the oracle at Delphi, and with it reshaped Sparta into the disciplined organism history would remember. He divided land equally among citizens, banned gold and silver currency, and trained boys from the age of 7 in the agorge, a grueling education of endurance, cunning, and silence. The kings presided over it all, yet they too were bound by law. Even divine blood could not rise above the order of Sparta. The result was paradoxical. Sparta was both deeply conservative and radically new. Its kingship survived while others faded, but in surviving, it ceased to resemble monarchy as the Greeks knew it. The Spartan kings were priests of Zeus, commanders of armies, symbols of continuity, But they were not autocrats. Their power came from obedience to custom, not command. They were living relics of a heroic age repurposed for a world that valued submission over glory. And yet that old fire still flickered beneath the surface. The kings of Sparta were not faceless administrators, they were descendants of heroes. When they marched to war, they did so surrounded by ritual. Before crossing the Eurotas River, they offered sacrifice. When they entered battle, a herald sang hymns to Castor and Pollux, the divine twins brothers of Helen and patrons of the Spartan people. To fight under a king's command was not merely to follow orders, it was to serve in a sacred lineage reaching back to Olympus. This faith in ancestry gave Sparta an almost supernatural unity. Even its defeats became holy. Later generations would immortalize Leonidas at Thermopylae, but that spirit, the willingness to die for law and kin, was born centuries earlier in the discipline of the dual dynasties. The Spartans did not seek empire or wealth. They sought permanence, a kind of living eternity built through restraint. And in that, they succeeded longer than most. The contrast with Athens could not have been sharper. Where Athens questioned, Sparta obeyed. Where Athens celebrated change, Sparta worshipped tradition. Yet the two cities were bound by the same inheritance, the Bronze Age memory of kingship and the conviction that power must be justified by something more than force. For Athens, that justification was reason. For Sparta, it was ritual. Each in its way preserved a fragment of the old Greek dynastic soul. It is easy to judge Sparta by its severity, to see only the training, the iron meals, the silences. But there is something strangely soothing in its predictability, its refusal to drift from custom. Every man knew his place, every king knew his limits. Life moved to a rhythm older than memory, as steady as the heartbeat of the Eurotas River flowing past the city walls. Imagine for a moment a Spartan dawn. The mountains glow faintly red. From the barracks comes the chant of young voices reciting the paean, a song to Apollo. The kings stand side by side in the temple of Athena Chalkioikos, offering sacrifice for the city's safety. Smoke rises, curling toward the still morning sky. There are no speeches, no debates, no applause, only discipline and faith. It is an image that feels both ancient and eternal, the embodiment of a dynasty that survives not through opulence, but through order. In this quiet discipline lies Sparta's paradoxical gift to history, the proof that a society can endure without innovation if it believes deeply enough in its structure. And though time would eventually grind even Sparta to dust the ideal, it forged a harmony between duty and destiny, would haunt every later civilization that sought to build perfection through control. The sound of waves lapping against Corinth's harbor was once the soundtrack of ambition. Long before marble temples gleamed there, the city was already awake, its streets alive with merchants shouting prices, sailors mending sails, and priests pouring libations to Poseidon. If Athens dreamed in philosophy and Sparta in discipline, Corinth dreamed in trade. It was the meeting point of two seas, the Aegean to the east, the Ionian to the west, and through its narrow isthmus flowed the wealth of the Mediterranean. But prosperity breeds envy, and envy in Greece often ended in blood. Corinth's dynastic tale begins with the Bacchiads, a clan so powerful, so self-assured, that they ruled not by law but by bloodline. Their ancestor Bacchus was said to have reigned in the 10th century BCE, a shadowy figure blending history and legend. After him, his descendants formed an oligarchy so tight-knit that for generations they intermarried exclusively among themselves. There were 200 of them, perhaps fewer, but their grip on Corinth was absolute. They controlled trade temples and politics. Their council decided who could speak, marry, or build a ship. To outsiders, it seemed less like a city and more like a family business with divine pretensions. Yet no dynasty survives on arrogance alone. By the 7th century, BCE, Corinth's harbor bustled with foreigners, craftsmen, and sailors, men who owed loyalty to profit, not to pedigree. The Bacchiads perched in their hilltop citadel began to look out of touch. The gap between their gilded symposiums and the crowded workshops below widened with every passing year. And from that tension rose a figure who would change not just Corinth, but the entire Greek world, Cypselus. His name came from a chest kypselos, because legend says he was hidden in one as a baby to escape the Bacchiads' wrath. His mother Labda was of noble blood, but not of the ruling line. When an oracle foretold that her son would overthrow the Bacchiads, they sent assassins to kill him. But the woman hid the child in a chest, and he survived. Years later, he returned to fulfill the prophecy. Whether or not the tale is true, it fits the Greek pattern perfectly. Destiny defiance and divine irony. Cypselus seized power without slaughter. He exiled some of the Bacchiads, spared others, and presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a restorer of order. The people loved him. After all, he broke the monopoly of the few. His reign brought stability and wealth. Corinth flourished under his rule. Ships poured from its docks, pottery from its kilns, art from its workshops. The Corinthian style of vase painting, with its elegant figures and decorative precision, became the envy of Greece. In the eyes of many, Cypselus had turned tyranny into prosperity. But power rarely stops with one man. After Cypselus came his son Periander, a name that would haunt Greek memory for centuries. Periander began like his father, ambitious and reform-minded. But as his rule lengthened, suspicion consumed him. He centralized trade, imposed harsh taxes, and crushed opposition with ruthless efficiency. Corinth's economy boomed, its walls gleamed, and yet its people whispered. The city that once loved freedom of exchange now lived under the weight of a single will. It is said Periander even consulted with other tyrants across Greece, trading secrets of control like merchants of fear. Still, even his cruelty bore fruit. He ordered the construction of the dialkos, a paved trackway that allowed ships to be dragged across the isthmus, a marvel of ancient engineering. It cut the journey between seas from weeks to hours. Through it, goods flowed endlessly: Egyptian grain, Phoenician dye, Athenian olive oil. Corinth became the toll gate of the Greek world, its treasury heavy with silver and pride. Yet behind the wealth, the Bacchiads' curse lingered. Periander, like so many tyrants, had inherited the paranoia of kings without the sanctity of lineage. Elsewhere in Greece, the ripple effect of Corinth's transformation was enormous. Other cities saw what a strong man could do, how tyranny, if shrewdly managed, could stabilize and enrich a polis choking on aristocratic rivalries. Soon tyrants sprouted like olive trees after rain: Orthagoras in Sicyon, Theagenes in Megara, Polycrates in Samos. Some were loved, some feared, but all claimed to restore justice against corrupt elites. In truth, most were opportunists who rose through populist cunning and military might. But to the common man, it hardly mattered. Better a single ruler who built temples than a council that starved the poor. Corinth's dynasties, first the Bacchiads, then the Cypselids, thus embodied the Greek paradox, the eternal oscillation between order and freedom, between law born of lineage and power seized by will. Both were dynasties, one of blood, one of ambition. Both believed themselves destined to rule, and both, in their own way, laid the groundwork for the civic experiments yet to come. By the late 6th century BCE, the Sipsalid line faltered. Periander's successors lacked his brilliance and his terror. Factionalism returned, and Corinth, though still rich, began to fade from political prominence. Yet its influence endured. Every Greek knew its story. Every tyrant invoked its founder's name, and every city feared that what happened there could happen again. Across the Aegean world, the air itself seemed to hum with change. The 7th and 6th centuries BCE were an age of experiment when the Greeks began to discover something greater than kingship law. It was not a sudden revelation, but a long deliberate awakening, as if the entire civilization was slowly remembering how to govern itself without gods or monarchs as intermediaries. The palatial dynasties had crumbled centuries before, and the tyrants who replaced them had shown how fragile charisma could be. Now the Greeks turned towards something quieter, subtler, and far more enduring, the written word carved into stone for all to see. The Archaic Age is often described as an age of poets and warriors, but it was also the age of lawgivers. The Nomothetai, whose names became legends, Zaleucus in Lokroi, Charondas in Catana, Lycurgus in Sparta, Solon in Athens, Draco before him. Each city, tired of cycles of revenge and corruption, reached for men of wisdom to bind its people with rules instead of oaths. For the first time in Greek history, justice began to detach itself from lineage and take root in the collective conscience. Draco of Athens came first, around 621 BCE. He codified what had once been arbitrary, the laws of the nobles, and inscribed them for all citizens to read. It was an act of revelation and terror alike, for his code was notoriously severe. Theft of fruit could mean death. Even minor crimes dripped with blood. Yet his intention was not cruelty, but clarity. By making justice visible, Draco forced the Athenians to confront the weight of their own traditions. The phrase draconian still survives, but perhaps unfairly for his harshness, was the growing pain of a city trying to become fair. Then came Solon. To speak his name is to feel a breeze of moderation sweep across the marble. Born into nobility, educated as a poet, Solon was chosen as Archon around 594 BCE to heal Athens' growing divisions. The city had grown rich through trade, but inequality festered like an unhealed wound. Small farmers, crushed by debt, were selling their children into slavery. The aristocrats feasted while the commoners starved. Solon's task was impossible: to reform a system without breaking it, to make law both compassionate and strong. He began with the Seisachtheia, the shaking off of burdens. Debts were cancelled, enslaved citizens were freed, and the hated mortgage stones, those markers of bondage, were torn from the fields. But Solon went further. He divided citizens not by birth, but by wealth, measured in bushels of grain produced each year. 4 classes emerged: Pentakosiomedimnoi, Hippes, Zeugidae, and Thetes, each with its own rights and duties. For the first time, status in Athens could rise or fall with effort. Nobility had been replaced by possibility. He codified laws governing marriage, trade, and crime. He established juries drawn from ordinary citizens, and most crucially, he opened political participation to those who owned no noble blood. His reforms were radical, but not revolutionary. Solon knew that true change must arrive gently, like rain on dry soil. He once said that he gave the Athenians not the best laws imaginable, but the best they were ready to accept. And in that humility lies his genius. Elsewhere, similar figures emerged, each tailored to his city's temperament. In Sparta, Lycurgus's great rhetor had already reshaped society into a living constitution of discipline. In Crete, Minos was remembered as the first lawgiver, his code said to have come from Zeus himself. In Sicyon, Cleisthenes, the elder reformed civic identity through clever manipulation of tribes and names, reducing aristocratic power without direct bloodshed. Greece was becoming a web of local experiments, each drawing from the same ancient instinct to balance freedom with order. The lawgivers were not philosophers in the modern sense, yet they prepared the way for philosophy. By defining justice, they made it possible to question it. By giving the people a voice, they taught them to listen to their own conscience. The polis was no longer merely a tribe with walls. It was a conversation, one that would echo through centuries. Still, the Greeks were human, and even in their reason lay contradiction. The new laws freed some, but bound others more tightly. Women remained excluded from citizenship, slaves remained property, and foreigners' metics could never truly belong. Yet for all its limits, this legal revolution was the hinge on which Greek civilization turned. Dynasties had ruled by divine favor, tyrants by charisma. But law was something eternal, something that could outlive both ruler and ruled. In the marketplaces of Ionia and the courtyards of Athens, a new sound joined the clamor of tradesmen reading aloud the words of Solon, debating their meaning beneath the open sky. They discovered that justice, like art, was an act of creation. To live under law was to participate in the shaping of one's own world. And though the Athenians would soon stumble again into tyranny, the memory of this brief balance between freedom and order would haunt them forever. Picture an Athenian evening during Solon's time. The agora still glows with sunset bronze catching the last light. A small crowd gathers before a stone stele inscribed with fresh laws. The letters are still crisp, the words foreign but thrilling. A potter, his hands stained with clay, reads slowly, mouthing each syllable as if tasting a new language. Nearby, an old aristocrat watches in silence, his jaw tight. For the first time, his privilege has limits. For the first time, justice belongs to everyone who can read. The story of Athens, like all Greek stories, moves in waves, each reform bringing calm before the next storm. Solon's laws had steadied the city, but they had not satisfied its hunger. The aristocrats grumbled that he'd gone too far. The poor muttered that he hadn't gone far enough, and in that fertile tension stepped the figure who would embody both order and ambition, Pisistratus, the first true tyrant of Athens. His rise was no mere grab for power. It was theatre clever, audacious, and almost absurdly Athenian. The Athens of the mid-6th century, BCE, was a restless place. The people had tasted equality and found it intoxicating, but the institutions were fragile. Factionalism divided the land into three: the Pediaes of the plains, the old aristocracy, the Paralioi of the coast merchants and sailors, and the Diakrioi of the hills, small farmers and herdsmen. Pisistratus, a war hero from the hills, understood something profound, that Athens knew politics could be won, not by inheritance, but by empathy. He courted the poor with generosity, the gods with piety, and the city itself with spectacle. One morning, he arrived in the agora bloodied and limping, claiming that enemies had tried to assassinate him. The people were outraged. They granted him a personal guard of 50 men armed with clubs. Those clubs soon became swords, and before anyone realized what had happened, Pisistratus had seized the Acropolis. For a brief moment, Athens had a tyrant. But tyranny, like drama, depends on audience reception. The nobles expelled him within a year. He would return twice more each time with greater cunning. His second return is the stuff of legend. He entered the city in a chariot beside a towering woman dressed as Athena herself, her face serene, her eyes flashing under the helmet's bronze crest. A herald proclaimed that the goddess was bringing Pisistratus back to restore order. The Athenians, lovers of theatre and omens alike, cheered wildly. Historians laugh at their gullibility, yet there is something almost poetic in their faith, a people so enamored with myth that they accepted their own ruler as part of it. Pisistratus's rule, once secured, proved surprisingly gentle. He exiled a few rivals, but left most institutions intact. Solon's laws remained, the courts functioned, and the assembly met as usual. The tyrant governed less as a despot and more as a benevolent manager. He reduced taxes for the poor, distributed loans for farmers, and encouraged festivals that bound the city together. Under his patronage, Athens blossomed into something it had never been before, a cultural capital. He expanded the Panathenaic festival, turning it into a grand procession celebrating both Athena and Athens. He commissioned the first definitive versions of Homer's epics to be recited publicly, unifying the city around a shared story of its heroic past. He built roads, aqueducts, and temples, including the early foundations of what would one day become the Parthenon. In his reign, the arts were no mere ornament, they were strategy. The poet, the sculptor, and the priest became his silent allies, crafting a civic identity so radiant that even tyranny looked like piety. Yet beneath this calm pulse of prosperity, the contradiction remained. Pisistratus called himself the protector of the people, but his guards stood at every corner. He claimed to serve Athena, but his wealth came from confiscated estates. The Athenians tolerated his rule because it gave them stability and pride, but freedom, once tasted, never truly sleeps. When Pisistratus died in 527 BCE, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus inherited his throne as though it were a dynasty, an irony for a city that had abolished kingship centuries earlier. At first, the succession seemed smooth. Hippias handled administration, Hipparchus the arts. The city continued to flourish. Poets like Anacreon and Simonides found patrons, and new temples rose in gleaming marble. But the balance that their father had maintained through charisma began to crack under pride. Hipparchus insulted a young noble named Harmodius and his lover, Aristogeiton. The lovers struck back, assassinating him during the Panathenaic procession. They were captured and executed, but the act would echo for generations. Athens began to call them tyrannicides, the liberators of the city. Hippias, shaken and bitter, turned harsh. He tightened control, executed rivals, and surrounded himself with mercenaries. The same citizens who had once cheered their ruler now whispered rebellion. The Alcmaeonid family, exiled by Pisistratus years earlier, sought their chance. With the help of Delphi's oracle and the Spartans, they returned, driving Hippias from the city in 510 BCE. The tyranny had lasted nearly half a century, but it ended, as most dynasties do, in blood exhaustion and the whisper of change. Yet Athens did not descend into chaos. Instead, from the ashes of one-man rule arose something wholly new. The people had learned under Pisistratus that a city could be organized beautiful and strong without needing divine kingship. They had seen how a single ruler could command loyalty by serving the collective good. When the tyrants fell, the citizens were ready for the next step. And in the years that followed, under Cleisthenes, Athens would transform again, this time not into another dynasty, but into democracy itself. Still, it's worth pausing before that leap, for in Pisistratus's Athens, we glimpse the peculiar tenderness of early Greek power tyranny that builds libraries, despotism, softened by poetry ambition, wrapped in ritual. The Greeks, even at their most autocratic, could not help but seek beauty. They ruled through narrative, not fear alone. Imagine the city at twilight in his day. From the Acropolis, the scent of incense drifts downward, mixing with the salt of the sea. Torches line the road to Eleusis. A procession moves slowly through the streets, musicians, dancers, priests, and common folk alike. In the distance, the tyrant watches from his balcony, neither hero nor villain, only human, a man who believed he could turn power into harmony. Even if just for one generation, when Hippias was driven from Athens, the city did not yet know what it had inherited. Power had been returned to the people, but the people were still learning who they were. Into that uncertain dawn stepped Cleisthenes of the Alcmaeonid family. The exile returned the reformer with the quiet smile, the man who would rearrange the city itself as if it were a game of stones on a board. His name does not shine like Pericles or Alexander, but his work transformed the world more deeply than any conquest. Under his hand, the Athenians ceased to be subjects and became citizens. It began with a rivalry, as most Greek revolutions did. After Hippias' fall, two noble factions vied for control. Isagoras, backed by conservative aristocrats, and Spartan allies, wanted to preserve privilege under a thin veil of reform. Cleisthenes, more cunning, turned his eyes to the demos, the ordinary Athenians weary of noble feuds. He promised them not gold nor bread, but belonging. That promise would remake Greece. His plan was nothing short of audacious. The Athenians had long been divided into 4 tribes, based on ancestry, each dominated by powerful families. Cleisthenes shattered this ancient pattern and replaced it with 10 new tribes based not on blood, but on geography. He scattered the clans deliberately, mixing coastal inland and city dwellers together, so that no local aristocracy could ever rule a single district again. It was a civic act of alchemy lineage dissolved into territory, kinship into community. For the first time in history, the structure of a state was designed to prevent dynasty itself. He created the Council of 500, chosen by lot from these tribes to manage daily governance. He reformed the assembly, giving every free male citizen the right to speak and vote. Even more radical was his invention of ostracism, a curious practice by which citizens could vote once a year to exile any man who grew too powerful. It was not punishment, merely precaution. 10 years of exile, no confiscation of property, no bloodshed. In this elegant act, Cleisthenes preserved freedom by acknowledging its fragility, and so almost quietly, the first democracy on earth unfolded not as rebellion, but as architecture. The Athenians did not storm palaces or hang their tyrants from trees. They redesigned their society like craftsmen. Every citizen became a living brick in the city's foundation. The agora turned from marketplace into parliament. Conversation became politics. Even the gods seemed to approve. At Delphi, the oracle praised Athens as a city led by many hands. Yet democracy in Athens was never purely ideal. Women slaves and foreigners still stood outside its circle, watching history through the cracks of the marble. But for those within the 30,000 citizens who gathered to vote on the Pnyx Hill, it felt like a revelation. No longer subjects of kings, no longer clients of tyrants, they had become the authors of their own destiny. It was imperfect, exclusionary, fragile, but it was alive. The rest of Greece looked on with fascination and alarm. To the oligarchs of Corinth and Thebes, Athenian democracy seemed reckless, a recipe for chaos. To the poets and philosophers of Ionia, it was a miracle. Herodotus, later writing of these times, would call freedom the father of greatness. And yet the price of that freedom would soon be tested by forces far beyond the walls of Athens. Because while Athens played at politics, an empire was watching from across the Aegean, the Empire of Persia. Its king Darius III ruled a domain stretching from Egypt to India. To him, the idea of citizens voting on war or peace was absurd. Power to Persia flowed from divine kingship. It was order made flesh. But Athens, small and unafraid, had helped the Ionian Greeks revolt against Persian rule. It was an act of defiance that would soon bring fire to its shores. Still, for the moment, Athens reveled in its transformation. The city's energy seemed boundless. New magistrates filled the record lists. New laws were inscribed on bronze. The Acropolis, still crowned by older temples, now looked down on a people who believed their hands, not their ancestors, shaped fate. Festivals grew more inclusive. Drama was born, tragedy and comedy performed not for kings, but for the crowd. The theater became democracy's mirror, where the people could watch their virtues and vices played out in verse. If you stood then at dawn upon the Areopagus hill, you would see a city unlike any that had ever existed. In the cool blue light, men gathered to debate taxes, military service, and sacred law. The hum of their voices, the murmur of argument, replaced the commands of monarchs. They did not call it freedom yet, but they felt it a new kind of strength that came from listening as much as speaking. And in the center of it all stood Cleisthenes, the quiet architect. He took no crown, built no palace, founded no dynasty. When his reforms were done, he faded from the record almost completely. His monument was the system itself. The Athenians called him Patates Demokratias, the father of democracy. But in truth, he was its midwife, guiding an unruly idea into fragile life, then stepping aside so that it might learn to walk on its own. His success carried a strange irony. By abolishing dynastic power, he made Athens itself into a dynasty of the mind. Its inheritance was not land or blood, but a pattern of thought skepticism, self-rule, the belief that no man's birth should weigh heavier than another's reason. That legacy would outlast every empire that followed. Still, history has a way of circling back upon itself. The democracy Cleisthenes built would face trial after trial. Wars, demagogues, plagues, and the temptations of empire. The Greeks were about to learn that freedom too can become a form of tyranny when wielded without humility. But for now, the city slept in peace, its people, unknowing that the greatest test of their new order was already sailing toward them from the east. The Aegean darkened beneath gathering clouds, and the soft hum of democracy gave way to the roar of destiny. For across the eastern horizon, Persia's empire stretched like a shadow, without end, its armies vast, its kings divine, its ambitions absolute. The Greeks, still divided by their jealous independence, could hardly imagine defying such power. Yet as the 5th century BCE dawned, a storm approached that would forge their identity and test every idea they had ever believed about freedom, lineage, and gods. It began not in Athens or Sparta, but in the Ionian cities of Asia Minor, where Greek colonies had long lived under Persian rule. These Ionian cities, Miletus, Ephesus, Smyrna, had once been jewels of commerce and philosophy. Under Persia, they prospered, but their pride chafed under foreign governors. In 499 BC, Aristagoras of Miletus led them in rebellion, a desperate, ill-coordinated uprising against the great king. Athens, still savoring its young democracy, sent a small force in solidarity. They helped burn Sardis, one of Persia's provincial capitals, and then fled, but the fire they kindled would burn for generations. Darius I, the Persian king, vowed revenge not merely on Athens, but on the entire Greek world. The empire that spanned continents would now turn its gaze toward one small, defiant peninsula. When the Persians came, they came like a tide ships, by the hundreds men, by the tens of thousands. Their advance was methodical, relentless. One by one, the Ionian cities fell, until finally, Miletus was razed, its people enslaved. The shock rippled westward. Greece, for the first time, began to see itself not as a collection of rival city-states, but as a shared civilization under threat. Even Sparta, aloof and cautious, felt the tremor. In 490 BC, Darius's army landed on the plain of Marathon, northeast of Athens. The Athenians, outnumbered, perhaps 3 to 1, stood shoulder to shoulder, with a small contingent from Plataea. There was no king to command them, only elected generals, and the collective courage of free men. The legend says they charged downhill into the Persian ranks, their bronze shields flashing in the morning sun. When the dust settled, Persia's seemingly invincible force lay broken on the sand. The victory at Marathon was more than a battle won. It was a new myth born. Freedom had taken flesh, and the world had noticed. But myths like victories are fragile. Darius died still planning revenge, and his son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the grudge. 10 years later, he returned with a force so vast that even Greek imagination struggled to number it, perhaps 200,000 men, perhaps more. From Asia to Europe, his bridges of ships spanned the Hellespont. His engineers carved canals through mountains. Persia was not merely invading. It was declaring cosmic order. Against this, the Greeks had only will. It was then that Leonidas of Sparta stepped into legend. At Thermopylae, the hot gates, he and his 300 warriors, joined by a few thousand allies, held the mountain pass against overwhelming odds. For 3 days, they fought until betrayal showed the Persians a secret path. Knowing death awaited, Leonidas dismissed most of his allies and stayed. When his body was found pierced with arrows, the Persians beheaded him. But the Greeks would remember him forever as the king who proved that honor could defy empire. Even as Thermopylae fell, Athens evacuated. The city burned its temples, devoured by flame. Yet out at sea, amid the narrow straits of Salamis, Themistocles, an Athenian statesman of humble birth, prepared a trap. His fleet of triremes, outnumbered but nimble, lured the Persians into the shoals. The battle that followed was thunder and splintering wood oars, snapping men shouting prayers to Athena. By nightfall, the Persian navy was shattered, its remnants fleeing eastward. The gods, it seemed, had taken the side of the free. The war did not end there. The following year at Plataea, the Spartans and Athenians fought side by side, and drove the Persians from Greece for good. It was an alliance born of desperation, but baptized in victory. When the dust settled, the Greeks stood astonished at what they had done. They had faced the greatest empire on earth and survived. From that survival, two ideas emerged that would define the next century. The first was the myth of heroism of men like Leonidas and Themistocles, whose cunning and courage proved that mortals could challenge gods. The second was the conviction that Greek freedom was unique, something sacred, and worth defending at any cost. From these beliefs, a new kind of pride was born, a pride that would soon transform Athens from a humble polis into an empire of its own. Back in Athens, the ruins still smoked. The Acropolis was blackened, the temples desecrated. But out of those ashes, a vision began to rise. Themistocles urged the city to rebuild its fleet, to fortify its harbor at Piraeus, to look not inward, but outward to the sea where the future waited. The age of kings and tyrants was over. The age of statesmen and strategists had begun. Sparta withdrew homeward content in its austerity, suspicious of Athenian ambition. But Athens could not sit still. The democracy that Cleisthenes had founded now pulsed with restless energy. Every man who had rowed at Salamis felt himself a guardian of the city's destiny. The assembly grew more confident, its orators more daring. The city began to dream of leading Greece itself, not as conqueror, but as protector. The Delian League was formed, a coalition of city-states bound to resist Persia forever. The treasury sat on the sacred island of Delos, its silver gleaming like moonlight upon water. Yet time, as always, reveals the hidden irony. The protector soon became master. The tribute sent by allied cities began to fund Athenian temples, Athenian fleets, Athenian pride. Democracy itself began to wear the crown of empire. But that too was a lesson yet to unfold. Greece stood victorious. Her independence preserved her gods, triumphant. The age of hero kings was past, but their spirit had returned in new form, in the citizen soldier, the strategist, the statesman. Where once dynasties ruled by divine blood, now men ruled by persuasion, by vote, by shared destiny. And perhaps, if the gods still watched from Olympus, they smiled faintly at the irony. Mortals, through courage and reason, had claimed the thunder for themselves. When the dust of the Persian wars finally settled, Greece seemed to exhale, long, weary, and triumphant. The gods had favored the free cities over the mighty empire, and Athens, scarred but unbroken, stood taller than all the rest. From its ashes would rise marble temples, golden statues, and a vision of life so luminous that later ages would simply call it the Golden Age. Yet golden things cast long shadows, and even as Athens shone, envy and fear began to gather beyond her walls. For victory, like all power, has a way of breeding the illusion that it will never fade. Themistocles, the hero of Salamis, was the first to glimpse what Athens could become. While Sparta gloried in discipline and isolation, Athens turned outward, to trade, to art, to empire. The Delian League, formed as a defensive alliance, soon became a vessel of Athenian will. Member states paid tribute in ships or silver to maintain a common fleet against Persia. But the ships obeyed Athenian admirals, and the silver piled up in Athenian coffers. The League's treasury, once kept on the sacred island of Delos, was eventually moved to the Acropolis itself, a gesture so bold it was almost divine theft. Athens was no longer simply a Greek city. It was the Greek city. Themistocles' cunning has ever urged fortification, The walls of Athens must be built, he said, so that no enemy ever again burns her temples. And built, they were massive stone ramparts connecting the city to its port, the long walls of Piraeus. With them, Athens became both land and sea power, an island upon the mainland. Themistocles' foresight secured her glory, but his ambition stirred suspicion. When he fell from favor, he fled into exile, and irony of ironies, found refuge in Persia. Even heroes, it seemed, could be undone by democracy's shifting winds. Into the vacuum stepped new voices. Cimon, son of Miltiades of Marathon, embodied the conservative ideal, noble, generous, and loyal to Sparta. Under his command, Athenian fleets swept across the Aegean, liberating cities still under Persian control. He brought home plunder slaves and prestige. Yet his friendship with Sparta made him unpopular with those who saw the old rival not as an ally, but as a threat. Athens, increasingly confident in her power, began to believe she no longer needed anyone else's approval, not even that of the gods. And then came Pericles. If Themistocles had been the architect of Athenian power, Pericles was its sculptor. Tall, eloquent, and almost otherworldly in his calm, he moved through the assembly like a conductor through his orchestra. He belonged to the Alcmaeonid line, noble yet progressive, a bridge between lineage and reason. Under his leadership, Athens became both empire and artwork, a democracy gilded in divine ambition. Pericles' genius lay not only in politics, but in vision. He persuaded the citizens to use the tribute from the Delian League to rebuild the Acropolis. It was a controversial act cloaked in piety. We are not spending their money, he argued, but protecting it in marble. And so, stone by stone, column by column, the Parthenon rose. Within its walls stood the statue of Athena Parthenos, crafted by Phidias, 40 feet tall, her spear glittering with gold and ivory. She was not merely a goddess now. She was the symbol of Athens herself, her image reflecting the city's new religion, the worship of its own greatness. But Pericles was no tyrant. His power came not from guards or swords, but from persuasion and patience. He introduced pay for public service, allowing even the poorest citizen to hold office. He encouraged festivals, drama, and debate. Under him, Athens became the stage of the human mind, where playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides turned myth into moral question, where sculptors found perfection in motion, where philosophers began to ask what it meant to live well rather than merely to live. It was for a brief and shining time, a city in conversation with the divine. And yet beneath that perfection cracks spread. Empire disguised itself as democracy. The allies of the Delian League found that tribute, once voluntary, was now demanded. When Naxos tried to leave, Athens besieged it. When Thasos rebelled, its walls were torn down. Freedom for the Athenians meant subjugation for others. Sparta watched in silence, uneasy. Her citizens saw in Athens not a sister in freedom, but a rival queen draped in marble. Still, to walk through Athens in those years was to feel the pulse of something eternal. The air was thick with song and argument. The streets glowed with the dust of sculpture and the scent of sacrifice. Citizens gathered at dawn on the Pnyx hill, their voices carrying across the plain. Some praised Pericles' vision, others warned of hubris. But all of them, rich or poor, noble or farmer, believed they were part of something divine. Never before, and perhaps never again, would a whole people feel so involved in the act of creation. Pericles himself moved like a man aware of history's gaze. He avoided luxury, spoke rarely, but with precision, and governed as though reason were sacred. His enemies accused him of vanity, but even they admitted his incorruptibility. Under his leadership, Athens became the light of the Greek world, its art, its language, its architecture, the envy of kings. And yet, like Icarus, the city soared too near the sun. For every marble temple built a grudge was formed. For every festival held a Spartan frown deepened. The balance of the Greek world, the delicate dance between Athens' brilliance and Sparta's discipline, was breaking. And in that imbalance lay the seed of the next great tragedy. But for now, imagine the glow of Athens at dusk in Pericles' time. The Parthenon gleams against the setting sun, its white stone turned to rose. Down below, the agora buzzes with laughter, the smell of wine and honey. Philosophers debate in the colonnades, poets recite verses to passing lovers, and children chase each other between olive trees planted by hands older than memory. The city seems eternal, unassailable, carved from light itself. The glow of Athens could not last forever. Greatness in Greece always carried the seed of its own undoing, for every column of marble raised a rival's resentment deepened. For every ode to freedom sung in the theatre somewhere, an ally felt the weight of Athenian tribute pressing down. Sparta, grim and watchful, looked northward and saw not the city of Athena, but an empire disguised in marble. The gods who had once smiled upon Greece's unity against Persia now seemed to watch in silence as the victors prepared to devour one another. The tension began quietly, as most tragedies do. In 460 BCE, Athens allied itself with Argos, Sparta's old enemy, and sent troops into the Peloponnese. The Spartans responded with suspicion and arms. The First Peloponnesian War flickered for years, a low fire of skirmishes and betrayals. Though neither side truly triumphed, the conflict changed something deep in the Greek soul. The old respect between Athens' freedom and Sparta's order began to rot into mutual contempt. In those years, Pericles emerged as the undisputed voice of Athens. His calm steadiness was both blessing and danger. While others blustered, he reasoned. While others sought glory, he sought permanence. He negotiated truces, built alliances, and continued to transform his city into the jewel of the Aegean. Yet even he could not disguise what Athens had become. The Delian League was no longer an alliance, but an empire, and its silver paid for the very beauty that made it loved and envied. The allies began to call themselves subjects. When peace finally returned, it lasted only long enough for the next war to gestate. In 431 BCE, after decades of rivalry and provocation, Sparta and its allies declared war on Athens. The Peloponnesian War would last nearly 30 years longer, than a generation longer, than any memory of unity. It was not merely a struggle of armies, but of ideas. Athens' democracy against Sparta's discipline, naval mastery against land-based endurance, idealism against austerity. At first, Athens seemed invincible. Her fleet ruled the seas, her walls unbroken, her treasury full. Pericles, cautious yet confident, advised restraint. Do not seek to enlarge our empire, he told the assembly, only to preserve it. But war has a way of eroding wisdom. The Spartan army invaded Attica, burning crops and villages. The Athenians, safe behind their walls, watched smoke rise from their fields, while their ships raided the Peloponnese. For 2 years, the stalemate held until an invisible enemy slipped through the gates. The plague came in the summer of 430 BCE. No army could stop it, no prayer appease it. Brought by ships from Egypt or the Levant, it spread through the crowded streets of Athens like wildfire. Fever, thirst, and despair swept the city. Corpses piled by the hundreds, families collapsed in the same rooms where they had once sung praises to Athena. Even the gods seemed struck silent. Thucydides, who survived the pestilence, wrote that law itself lost its meaning. Men lived for the day, indifferent to right or wrong. Pericles fell ill, but recovered long enough to lead once more. Yet grief had broken even his measured voice. His sons were dead. His friends buried his faith in the people shaken. The city that had once adored him now accused him of hubris, blaming him for the war, for the plague, for everything. They stripped him of his command. Later, they begged him back, desperate for the steadiness only he could bring. But it was too late. In 429 BCE, Pericles died quietly, the city's last guiding star fading into the fevered night. Without him, Athens turned restless. Demagogues, men of thunderous voice but shallow vision, rose to fill the void. Cleon, bold and merciless, urged total war, burn the enemy's cities, crush rebellion without pity. The democracy that had once celebrated reason now cheered for vengeance. Across the Gulf, Sparta too had changed. Its kings and generals, once symbols of restraint, adopted Athenian tactics, hiring fleets, courting Persian gold. The war poisoned both sides until neither resembled the virtues they claimed to defend. Yet even amid the ruin, the Athenian spirit found strange beauty. Playwrights turned pain into poetry. Euripides wrote tragedies of madness and exile. Sophocles composed Oedipus at Colonus, a meditation on fate written as his own city decayed. In their words, Athens confronted itself not as goddess or empire, but as mortal, flawed human. The war dragged on, battles came and went, Pylos, Amphipolis, Delium. Heroes died, treaties broke, hope flickered. Then came Alcibiades, brilliant and dangerous, a man of noble birth and shameless charm. Student of Socrates, lover of luxury, he embodied the contradictions of Athens itself. His ambitions were boundless, his loyalty slippery. It was he who persuaded the assembly to invade distant Sicily, promising easy victory and endless wealth. The Sicilian expedition would prove Athens' greatest folly. In 415 BCE, 200 ships sailed west, carrying thousands of soldiers and dreams of conquest. None would return. The campaign collapsed in disaster. The army was annihilated, the survivors enslaved. News of the catastrophe reached Athens like a funeral bell. The empire staggered, its enemies circled. Sparta, aided by Persian gold, built a fleet and closed the sea. By 404 BCE, Athens, starved and surrendered. Its walls were torn down, its fleet destroyed. The Parthenon still stood, gleaming in the sun, but the spirit that had built it was broken. Democracy itself was briefly overthrown by an oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, a bitter irony that Athens, once the teacher of liberty, now learned tyranny at home. Yet even in defeat, something immortal stirred. Within a generation, democracy returned, bruised but alive. The Athenians rebuilt their walls, their ships, their faith. They could lose battles, lose empire, even lose innocence, but never their conviction that life must be argued, not obeyed. Out of the long exhaustion of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens lay humbled and Sparta stood unchallenged, a new wind began to stir in the north, a whisper from the rugged highlands of Macedon. While the great southern cities argued over lost glory, this harsh and half-barbarian kingdom was quietly gathering its strength. The Greeks in their pride scarcely noticed. To them, Macedonians were outsiders, rustic cousins, who spoke a rough dialect and worshipped the same gods with too much wine and too little grace. Yet destiny has ever preferred the underestimated. From this land of hunters and horsemen would rise a dynasty that would unify Greece and conquer half the known world. Its architect was Philip II of Macedon. When he took the throne in 359 BCE, his kingdom was fractured, its borders threatened by Illyrians, Thracians, and rival claimants. Yet Philip possessed what Greece had forgotten: patience. He had spent his youth as a hostage in Thebes, where he observed the famed Theban generals Epaminondas and Pelopidas transform warfare with discipline and strategy. From them, he learned that genius in battle was not about strength alone, but organization, the art of men moving as one mind. When he returned to Macedon, he reshaped his army into a living machine. The Macedonian phalanx was his masterpiece, a formation of long pikes, sarissas held in unbroken rows, bristling like a field of iron reeds. Behind them came cavalry, trained to perfection, striking like lightning wherever the enemy faltered. With these tools, Philip did what no Greek city had managed in centuries. He united his people. Then, piece by piece, he turned his gaze southward towards the old fractured world of Greece. Athens, ever eloquent and proud, mistrusted him. Demosthenes, the fiery orator, thundered in the assembly against the barbarian from the north. His Philippics warned that Philip's friendship was merely conquest disguised as diplomacy. But Athens, weakened by war, and nostalgia, hesitated. Sparta, still proud but isolated, refused alliance. Thebes, confident after its brief ascendancy, misjudged its enemy's speed. Philip advanced not merely with armies, but with cunning. He offered peace to some marriage alliances, to others bribes where words failed. To the Greeks, who had spent a century mastering debate but forgetting unity, his decisiveness was alien, almost divine. One by one, city-states fell into his orbit, some by persuasion, others by the sword. The climax came at Cheronea in 338 BCE. There Philip's forces met the combined armies of Athens and Thebes. Among his cavalry rode a young prince, his son Alexander, just 18. The battle was brutal and final. When the dust cleared, Greece was conquered, though not enslaved. Philip did not raise its cities. He summoned them instead to Corinth, where he proposed something astonishing: a common peace and a unified campaign against Persia. For the first time, the Greeks stood, however reluctantly, under one banner. The dream of Panhellenism of Greece, united, had finally been achieved, not by philosophers or lawgivers, but by a Macedonian king with a soldier's patience. Philip's League of Corinth declared him hegemon leader of all Greece. The irony was exquisite. After centuries of proclaiming that no man should rule, another Greece had found stability in monarchy once more. But fate, never content, intervened. In 336 BCE at Aegae, during his daughter's wedding, Philip was struck down by an assassin's blade. The theater erupted in panic. The king fell before the altar. Rumor whispered that his wife Olympias, fierce and jealous, had arranged it. Others blamed Persian agents or disgraced officers. Whatever the truth, his death left behind a kingdom both magnificent and unstable, and a son who would become legend. Alexander inherited not only his father's crown, but his vision. Barely 20, he moved with terrifying speed. He crushed revolts in Thebes and Thessaly, reminding Greece that Macedon's grip would not loosen. When Thebes dared to defy him, he razed it to the ground, sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. Athens watched in silence, trembling at the message. Greece was united not by consent, but by necessity. Yet Alexander was not content to rule Greece alone. From the beginning, he believed himself chosen for something greater, a destiny whispered by oracles written in the stars. He spoke often of Achilles, claiming descent from him through his mother's line, and carried a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, his tutor. He saw in Homer's heroes not myth, but prophecy. Where Achilles sought glory in battle, Alexander sought to fuse glory and eternity. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia, flinging a spear into the soil and proclaiming it spear-won land. The invasion of Persia had begun. With an army of barely 40,000 men, he faced forces 10 times his number and shattered them again and again at the Granicus, at Issus, at Gaugamela. Each victory was a thunderclap. Each city he took a new constellation added to his name. Yet through all this conquest, Greece traveled with him, not its armies, but its culture, its language, its gods. Macedon had given him might, but Greece had given him meaning. Behind him, the old city-states could only watch half in awe, half in despair. Athens, now a client of Macedon, continued its festivals and plays its debates and dramas, pretending still to lead the Greek world. Sparta remained aloof, refusing to join the Persian campaign, clinging to its pride even as its influence faded. But all of Greece, willingly or not, was being carried eastward in Alexander's shadow. Philip's dream had been to unite Greece and conquer Persia. Alexander would do both and more. Yet before his story could be told, the old Greece, the Greece of city-states and shifting alliances of philosophers and artists, and small proud wars, had already reached its twilight. What began in the palaces of Mycenae and the councils of Solon was ending in the barracks of Macedon. The dawn that rose for Alexander was like no other in Greek memory, blinding golden and merciless. From the northern mists of Macedon, he descended upon Asia like a storm given flesh, a man not content with rule, but with the rewriting of the world itself. In him, the long arc of Greek dynasties found both its summit and its end, one lineage of kings stretching back to the shadowed halls of Mycenae, now condensed into a single figure who would carry Greece beyond its borders into legend. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE, he paused upon the shore and cast a spear into the soil. "I claim Asia," he said, "not as a gift of the gods, but as the prize of men." His army was small by Persian standards, 40,000 men, a patchwork of Macedonians, Thessalians, and Greeks from the conquered cities of the south. But it was disciplined, loyal, and carried with it the invincible conviction that destiny itself marched in its ranks. Behind him, Greece stood uncertain, half proud and half afraid. Ahead lay an empire that had ruled from Egypt to India for 2 centuries. At the river Granicus, he met his first test. The Persian satraps, confident in their numbers, underestimated the fury of the 20-year-old king. Alexander charged straight across the river, spear lowered his white plume, cutting through the mist. Arrows darkened the sky. Horses screamed. His men faltered for a moment, then followed. When the dust cleared, the Persian line was broken. The Greeks of Asia, long under foreign rule, hailed him as liberator. From that moment on, he stopped merely fighting for conquest. He began fighting for myth. City after city opened its gates, Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus. The temples of Ionia rang once more with Greek hymns. Alexander sent gifts to Athens, dedications to Delphi, and proclamations written in the pure Attic tongue. He was conquering not only lands, but identity, gathering the scattered children of Hellas beneath one banner. At Issus, a year later, he met Darius III, King of Kings, in battle. The Persian army stretched to the horizon chariots, elephants, tens of thousands of archers. But Alexander saw only opportunity. With a swift cavalry charge, he pierced the Persian center, scattering nobles and guards alike. Darius fled, leaving behind his mother, wife, and daughters. Alexander treated them with respect, refusing ransom, calling the women royalty still. To the Greeks, this mercy seemed godlike. To the Persians, it seemed like the birth of a new monarch who might yet wear their own crown. He marched south through Phoenicia and Gaza, taking city after city until he stood before Egypt. There he was greeted not as conqueror, but as deliverer. The priests of Memphis crowned him pharaoh. In the desert of Siwa, the oracle of Ammon hailed him as the son of Zeus. The legend of divine birth, once the privilege of mythic kings, now clothed him like armor. The boy from Bela had become a god among mortals. Then east again to Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. The Persian capitals fell, one by one, their treasures carted west, their palaces aflame. When he entered Persepolis, he paused before the great hall of Xerxes and ordered torches lit. The fire devoured the cedar beams, the painted walls, the memory of empire. Later, he would regret it, calling it drunken folly. But the world remembered the image. Greece at last avenged her conqueror crowned by firelight. Yet conquest, like wine, intoxicates. The farther Alexander marched, the less he seemed Macedonian or even Greek. He began to wear Persian robes, to demand prostration from his courtiers, to marry Eastern princesses. His generals murmured that he was forgetting who he was. But Alexander saw further. He dreamed of fusion, a new world where Greek reason and Eastern majesty might live as one. He founded cities named Alexandria across his empire, each with a gymnasium, a theater, and a marketplace. Small replicas of Athens scattered through Asia. Greek language became the silk of empire, weaving together tribes that had never shared a word before. In 331 BCE at Gaugamela, he met Darius again in one final terrible contest. The battlefield stretched wide as a sea. The Persians outnumbered him 5-1. Yet the phalanx held the cavalry struck, and once more Darius fled. The Achaemenid Empire, which had once threatened Greece with annihilation, was finished. Alexander entered Babylon as its new king, and for the first time, the world lay open before a single ruler who spoke Greek. But even as his power grew, something in him began to break. The simple grace of his early victories gave way to suspicion, cruelty, and loneliness. He executed Parmenion, his father's old general, on rumors of betrayal. He killed his friend Clytus in a drunken rage. He began to believe his own divinity, to dream of conquering the edges of the world, the lands beyond India, the sources of the ocean river itself. His men, exhausted and homesick, begged him to turn back. When he wept before the Hyphasis River, saying there were no more worlds to win, they refused to follow. Still, his journey changed everything. The Greeks who marched with him married Persian women, learned new languages, brought home silk ivory and ideas. They returned not as conquerors, but as witnesses to the vastness of the world. The Hellenic spirit, curious, restless, rational, flowed eastward like a tide. Cities such as Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Seleucia on the Tigris became the beating hearts of a new age, the Hellenistic world. In 323 BCE at Babylon, Alexander fell ill after a night of feasting. He was 32. Fever took him swiftly. When his generals asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered to the strongest. Then his voice faded, and with it, the last echo of 1,000 years of Greek kingship. Outside his chamber, the torches guttered in the hot wind. Soldiers wept. Priests prayed. The stars themselves seemed to dim. Greece, once a cluster of quarrelsome city-states, had become the language of half the earth. But Alexander's death shattered the illusion of unity. His empire would fracture, as all dynasties do, into shards that would glitter for centuries. Yet in every shard, every coin, every column, every word of philosophy, the light of Greece remained. When the god-king of Macedon was carried to his tomb, the air of Babylon shimmered with heat and grief. The man who had redrawn the map of the world lay breathless, and the empire he had built from Greece to India trembled like a mirage. In death, Alexander left behind no heir strong enough to wield his thunder. His generals' men, who had once sworn brotherhood under his banner, now gathered like vultures around a fallen lion. The dream of one world, one ruler, one dynasty, dissolved overnight into ambition and suspicion. And thus began the age of the Diadochi, the successors each believing himself the rightful heir of the conqueror, each determined to carve his share from the corpse of empire. Perdiccas. The regent tried first to hold the unity together. He guarded Alexander's infant son, born posthumously to Roxana, as though the child's breath might preserve legitimacy. But the empire was too vast, too hungry. In distant satrapies, the generals moved their armies as if drawn by invisible hands. Antigonus took Asia Minor. Seleucus eyed Babylon. Ptolemy, shrewd and calm, seized Egypt. He even intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege, stealing the body and bringing it to Memphis. Whoever possessed the king's remains, he knew possessed a fragment of his divinity. The wars that followed lasted decades. Wars not of nations, but of egos, where brothers in arms became dynastic founders. Each claimed to defend Alexander's vision. Each, in truth, sought to replace him. The dust of his campaigns rose again, this time mixed with betrayal. From Gaza to the Taurus Mountains, from the Nile to the Indus, the roar of conquest returned. But now it was Greek against Greek. Ptolemy proved the most cunning. While others fought over Asia, he fortified Egypt and built Alexandria into the greatest city of the Mediterranean. There, beneath marble colonnades and the scent of lotus blossoms, he founded a dynasty that would last for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies crowned themselves pharaohs, blending Greek reason with Egyptian divinity. They married their sisters as the ancient gods had done. They ruled through both temples and libraries. Under their patronage, the Library of Alexandria rose a temple of thought that gathered scrolls from every corner of the world. Within its halls, mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and poetry coexisted like stars in a single sky. The city itself became Greece, reborn in Africa. Its harbor crowded with ships, its streets a babel of tongues united by Greek speech. To the east, Seleucus carved out an empire even larger, stretching from Syria to Persia. The Seleucid realm shimmered with contradictions, a Greek veneer laid over ancient Eastern traditions. Its kings built new cities named for themselves: Antioch, Seleucia, Apamea. They adorned them with theaters, gymnasia, and colonnades, yet ruled over millions who neither spoke Greek nor cared for its debates. Their dynasty endured through balance, a dance between Macedonian heritage and Persian grandeur. But the farther east, their kings pushed, the thinner that balance grew. Revolt after revolt splintered their vast dominion until it was less an empire than a patchwork quilt of loyalties. In Macedon itself, Antigonus and his descendants, the Antagonids, struggled to keep the homeland intact. They fought the Gauls, who poured down from the north, the Spartans who dreamed of independence, the Aetolian and Achaean leagues that rose and fell like waves. For nearly a century, the Antagonid kings ruled from Pella and Thessalonica, invoking Alexander's name as shield and talisman. Yet even they knew that the age of heroes was fading. The Greeks they governed no longer saw themselves as heirs of conquest, but as curators of culture. Still, the Hellenistic world glowed with vitality. Greek art, once confined to temples, now adorned cities from Afghanistan to the Nile. Statues grew fluid and emotional. Philosophers turned their gaze inward, searching for peace in a restless universe. Stoicism and Epicureanism arose schools of thought for men weary of empire. Meanwhile, Greek became the shared language of scholarship, commerce, and law. A merchant in Alexandria could write to a banker in Antioch or a governor in Bactria and be understood. The world had become in spirit, if not in governance, Greek, and yet beneath this brilliance, decay crept. The successor kingdoms were dynasties in name, but seldom in spirit. Sons murdered, fathers, brothers, betrayed brothers, regents usurped crowns. The blood of Alexander's companions seemed to poison their heirs. The Ptolemies of Egypt married and killed within their own family, their court a tangle of intrigue and silk. The Seleucids fought endless civil wars. Provinces slipped away one by one. The Antagonids watched helplessly as Rome, once a distant curiosity in the West, grew into a quiet and patient threat. Still, there were moments of wonder. In Alexandria, the mathematician Euclid shaped geometry into eternal form. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth with shadows and intellect alone. In Pergamon, artists carved marble that seemed to breathe. In Antioch, scholars catalogued the stars. Greece had conquered the world, and though her political power waned, her mind continued to reign. It is tempting to call this era decline, but perhaps it was transformation. The Greeks had traded the spear for the stylus, the phalanx for the library. Where Alexander had sought to rule the body of the world, his successors ruled its imagination. The dynasties they founded became conduits through which Greek thought mingled with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian ideas. The result was not purity, but synthesis, the seedbed of modern civilization. And yet even synthesis has its shadows. By the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemies grew decadent, the Seleucids desperate, the Antagonids exhausted. Their coins still bore the image of Alexander, but the eyes had grown empty. Across the sea, a new people were watching the Romans, methodical and unromantic, who admired Greek art, even as they prepared to possess it. The torch that Alexander had carried eastward was about to be claimed from the west. In the sun-baked gleam of Alexandria, the Ptolemies learned to rule with both intellect and illusion. Egypt had once bent beneath Persian satraps and native pharaohs, but now it bowed to Macedonian kings who called themselves Greeks by birth, Egyptians by right, and gods by necessity. Ptolemy, Sota, Alexander's old general and friend, laid the foundation. His descendants turned his careful statecraft into the most dazzling dynasty of the Hellenistic world. Under their rule, Alexandria became the mirror of human curiosity, a city of marble and papyrus logic and legend. The Library of Alexandria rose like a temple to reason its shelves groaning with hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars worked in sunlight that filtered through alabaster windows, copying, translating, and arguing. Here, the words of Homer found commentary, the numbers of Pythagoras found proof, and the geometry of Euclid became the silent architecture of the cosmos. At night, astronomers at the Museon, the sacred research complex beside the library, charted stars from the observatory roof, naming constellations that still shimmer above us. It was said that in Alexandria, the mind could walk farther than armies ever had, but wisdom has its own politics. The Ptolemies understood that the pursuit of knowledge could be as powerful as conquest. They funded scholars and priests, poets and physicians, not merely for curiosity's sake, but to weave legitimacy around their reign. They built temples to Greek gods beside shrines to Egyptian ones, creating a seamless religion of dual faces: Zeus, Ammon, Serapis, Isis, Aphrodite. In this fusion of divine names, they made peace between two civilizations. To their Greek subjects, they were enlightened monarchs. To the Egyptians, divine heirs of the pharaohs. In this delicate masquerade lay the secret of their survival. Yet dynasties like stars burn brightest before they collapse. The Ptolemies grew rich beyond measure, but also paranoid and cruel. Their court at Alexandria glittered with gold and treachery. Brother married sister to preserve the purity of their divine blood, while poison exile and whispered murders became the currency of succession. The line blurred between ceremony and tragedy, until power itself seemed to rot beneath the scent of incense. And yet the brilliance of Alexandria never dimmed entirely. Under Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, the city reached its height. He expanded the library, completed the pharaohs, the great lighthouse that towered over the harbor, one of the 7 wonders of the world, and filled the streets with festivals and processions. Scholars like Callimachus compiled the first catalogue of all known books. The physician Herophilus dissected human bodies, mapping veins and nerves in pursuit of truth. The poet Theocritus, in verses soft as sea wind, invented pastoral poetry. Knowledge was not merely gathered here, it blossomed, but elsewhere cracks spread. The Seleucid Empire to the east, stretching from Syria to Persia, was decaying under the weight of distance. Its kings fought endless wars against Parthians' Jews, and even their own kin. Antiochus III, the so-called Great, briefly revived its fortunes, marching as far as India and dreaming of restoring Alexander's unity. Yet when he turned westward, he found a new adversary, Rome. The legions met him in Asia Minor and shattered his army. The gods of Olympus were being replaced by iron discipline and engineering. Meanwhile, in Macedon, the Antagonids struggled to hold a restless homeland. Greek city-states, weary of foreign dynasts, flirted with independence. Through leagues and confederations, the Aetolian and Achaean Leagues experiments in collective freedom that echoed the old polis spirit. But without unity, they could not stand against the new power rising from the Italian peninsula. Rome's strength lay not in marble or myth, but in method, roads, legions, law. The world was shifting from the dreamlike beauty of Hellenism to the hard prose of empire. Still, the Hellenistic kingdoms left behind something Rome could never extinguish: a universal culture. From Egypt to Bactria, from the Euphrates to Sicily, Greek had become the common language of thought. Merchants, scholars, and diplomats spoke it. Temples used it. Even the Romans studied in it. The descendants of Alexander's generals might have lost their crowns, but their civilization had already conquered the conquerors. In the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemies faced the same creeping inevitability. Civil wars weakened Egypt, famine and corruption hollowed it. The priests still called their rulers divine, but the people no longer listened. In the palace by the sea, the line of kings and queens turned inward, devouring itself. The great pharaohs still lit the night, but the flame seemed dimmer. The once mighty Seleucid Empire fractured completely, while Macedon fell at last to Rome's armies. The Greek world was being swallowed piecemeal, its fragments shining briefly before sinking into the new Roman sea. And yet in the shadows of decline, one figure would rise to give the Ptolemaic dynasty a final blaze of splendor. A queen whose intelligence rivaled any philosopher's, whose presence could disarm generals and emperors alike. Cleopatra VII. Last of her line would inherit not only the throne of Egypt, but the legacy of Greece itself. Through her, the blood of Alexander's companions would stand face to face with the heirs of Rome. But that encounter was still a few decades away. For now, imagine Alexandria at night during its height. The harbor close with the light of the pharaohs, a beacon so bright that sailors can see it for 30 miles across the sea. Music drifts from palaces and taverns. The scent of myrrh and papyrus fills the air. On the steps of the library, a scholar reads by torchlight, tracing words written centuries before in Athens words that will one day pass into Arabic Latin and every language born thereafter. Above him, the stars shimmer in constellations named by Greeks, studied by Egyptians. East of the Nile's shimmer, where the Tigris and Euphrates wound through old Persian soil, another Greek dynasty was fading into dusk. The Seleucid Empire, once the largest of Alexander's successor realms, had grown too vast for its veins. Its kings still minted coins bearing the proud profiles of Antiochus and Seleucus, but their borders shifted like mirages, shrinking each decade as provinces slipped away. What had begun as the backbone of a new Hellenic order was dissolving into fragments, one of history's grandest sandcastles crumbling back into the desert. Seleucus III Nicator had dreamed of a realm that joined east and west, a place where Babylonian starlight mingled with Greek geometry and where roads stitched together 1,000 cultures under the same sky. He founded Seleucia on the Tigris as his capital, a city planned with geometric precision, its streets wide enough for elephants. He filled it with Greek settlers, theaters, temples, and academies, imagining it as a second Athens, rational, ordered, eternal. Yet empires rarely obey geometry. His descendants, each named Antiochus or Seleucus, inherited not only his vision, but his vulnerabilities. Ambition stretched thin armies, divided heirs, born of rival queens and shifting loyalties. The Seleucid kings ruled lands that included Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, and even parts of India for a time. But each region had its own heartbeat, its own gods. The Persians revered Ahura Mazda. The Babylonians still prayed to Marduk. The Jews in Judea spoke of one invisible God who would tolerate no idols. The Greek tongue may have been official, but it floated over this sea of faiths like a fragile raft. Every few decades, rebellion rose an echo of local pride against foreign cosmopolitanism. By the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucids were fighting wars on too many fronts. The Parthians swept in from the Iranian plateau, fierce horsemen who carved away the eastern provinces. The Jews rebelled under the Maccabees, winning a measure of independence and leaving the Seleucid name cursed in their chronicles. The Romans advanced from the west, their legions steady and merciless. Each defeat stripped another jewel from the empire's crown. Yet for all its decline, the Seleucid world remained a crucible of cultural fusion. Greek theatres stood beside ziggurats, philosophers debated Zoroastrians, astronomers studied both Babylonian star charts and Aristotelian logic. Antioch, their western capital, was a wonder of the age, its colonnaded streets buzzing with merchants from Egypt, India, and the Aegean. Perfume from Arabia mingled with olive oil from Greece. Statues of Apollo watched over markets where Aramaic and Greek voices overlapped in argument. It was a civilization constantly reinventing itself, even as it decayed, a candle burning bright at both ends. Antiochus III, called the Great, tried one last time to restore the empire's reach. He marched east, reclaiming lost provinces as far as the Indus. For a brief, gleaming moment, it seemed that Alexander's shadow had returned. But ambition pulled him westward toward Greece itself, where he hoped to challenge Rome. The gods were not with him. In 190 BCE at Magnesia, his armies met the legions and broke like glass. Rome's discipline was something no phalanx could withstand. The Seleucids paid dearly treasure hostages' pride. The decline that followed was not sudden, but inevitable. His descendants fought among themselves, puppets of foreign powers. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, brilliant but erratic, styled himself a god on earth, filling temples with his image. His arrogance sparked the Maccabean revolt in Judea, one of the first wars in history fought not for land but for religious identity. The Seleucids, torn by civil war, never truly recovered. Within a century, Parthia ruled the East, Armenia took the north, and Rome crept steadily into Syria. The once mighty heirs of Seleucus dwindled to petty kings in Antioch, their coins growing smaller, their faces more haunted. And yet, even as their realm disintegrated, their influence persisted. Greek art and architecture continued to flourish across the Near East. The Seleucid policy of city founding, those endless Alexandrias and Antiochs, left behind a lattice of urban centers that would outlive the dynasty by millennia. Their coins spread Hellenic imagery deep into Asia. Their scholars transmitted Greek science to Babylonian scribes. Their traders carried philosophies eastward along the Silk Roads. The Seleucid Empire may have failed politically, but it succeeded cosmically. It spread the Greek mind into the heavens. In their twilight, the Seleucid kings clung to ceremony. Antioch's processions remained lavish, its theaters full, its temples resounding with hymns to Zeus, and local gods blended into one pantheon. But outside the city walls, Roman merchants counted coins, and Parthian cavalry drilled in the distance. The world was changing its accent. Imagine Antioch in its final century. The evening air is heavy with incense. Torches flicker along marble colonnades. A philosopher from Athens debates a Persian magus over the nature of the soul. A Jewish merchant passes muttering a prayer to the one God. In the palace, the king feasts with his courtiers, unaware that beyond the mountains, Rome is already discussing his succession. The river Orontes glows red with sunset, carrying whispers of past glory to the sea. The Seleucids had sought to bind the world in Greek thought. Instead, they became the bridge through which that thought flowed onward. They were the twilight. After Alexander's noon, a dynasty, both tragic and luminous, remembered less for what it held than for what it gave away. North of the fading Seleucid lands, among the forests and mountain passes of Old Macedon, the last branch of Alexander's lineage clung to its homeland like ivy on ruined stone. The Antigonid dynasty, descendants of Antigonus One-Eye, that indomitable general who had fought for his share of Alexander's empire, had outlasted its rivals through shrewdness, discipline, and an instinct for survival. They were less glamorous than the Ptolemies of Egypt or the Seleucids of Asia, but more enduring. For nearly a century and a half, they ruled the cradle of Greece itself, Macedon balancing diplomacy and steel in equal measure. Their founder, Antigonus, had once dreamed of restoring Alexander's unity, but ambition exceeded his reach. He fell in battle at Ipsus in 301 BCE, his vast empire divided by his former allies. Yet his bloodline endured through his son, Demetrius, called Poliocates, the besieger of cities, a man of endless charm and reckless passion. Demetrius was the first of a new breed of Hellenistic kings, not divine conquerors, but performers of majesty. He sailed into Athens not as tyrant, but as savior, adorned with purple robes and flanked by statues of himself. The Athenians, in their hunger for heroes, greeted him as a god, naming temples after him. But glory in Greece was a fickle crown. Within years, he too was driven into exile. Still, his descendants learned from his chaos. By the time of Antigonus II, Gonatas, grandson of Demetrius Macedon, had recovered a sense of order. Gonatas was no dreamer. He ruled not by conquest, but by patience. Under him, Macedon became the quiet power of the Greek world. Its armies disciplined its treasury, modest but steady. He sponsored philosophers in Athens and kept poets at his court, blending the soldier's stoicism with a scholar's restraint. While the Ptolemies built lighthouses and the Seleucids chased mirages of empire, Gonatas built stability. But peace in Greece was always temporary. The city-states, exhausted by centuries of rivalry, now formed leagues to protect their autonomy: the Aetolian League in the north, the Achaean League in the south. These confederations spoke of shared government and common defense, but in truth, they were fragments of the old polis pride, rearranged into new forms. The Antagonids watched them warily, knowing that even small alliances could ignite like tinder in a land so accustomed to glory. Then, like a storm rolling over the Adriatic, Rome appeared. At first, the Romans came not as conquerors, but as arbiters, mediating disputes between Greek leagues and Macedonian kings. They professed admiration for Greek culture, built temples to Greek gods, sent their sons to study in Athens. But beneath that courteous exterior lay calculation. Rome's senators understood that culture and conquest were twin blades, and they intended to wield both. Philip V of Macedon, descendant of Antigonus, was the first to test Rome's patience. Proud, brilliant, and restless, he sought to revive Macedonian influence over the Aegean. His ambitions brought him into conflict with Pergamon and Rhodes' Greek allies of Rome. The First Macedonian War ended inconclusively, but the second would end everything. In 197 BCE at Cynoscephalae, the Dogs' Heads, a ridge of hills in Thessaly, the phalanx of Macedon met the manipular legions of Rome. The clash was terrible and decisive. For the first time, the proud Macedonian formation, perfected by Philip II and Alexander, met its match. The Roman system, flexible and cruelly efficient, broke through the pike lines and cut the phalanx to pieces. Philip fled, his army, shattered, his glory gone. Rome, magnanimous in victory, allowed him to keep his throne, but the leash had been fixed. His son Perseus, the last Antigonid king, would not accept it. Determined to reclaim independence, he raised armies, minted coins, bearing his proud profile, and courted alliances with discontented Greek states. But the old magic was gone. The world no longer feared Macedon. It pitied her. In 168 BCE at Pydna, the legions came again. As the sun set behind Mount Olympus, Perseus watched his phalanx grind forward, dense invincible, until the ground itself betrayed them. Uneven terrain broke their ranks. Roman swords slipped through the gaps. When the battle ended, Macedon's army lay silent, its king a prisoner. Rome divided the kingdom into provinces. The line of Antigonus, the last of the true Macedonian dynasties, ended in chains. The age of Greek kingship, born in the Bronze Age and glorified by Alexander, had finally yielded to a new order, not of heroes and philosophers, but of bureaucrats and generals from across the Western Sea. Yet even in defeat, Greece triumphed in subtler ways. Roman conquerors carried home Greek tutors, Greek architects, Greek dreams. They built temples in the Doric style, studied the tragedies of Sophocles, and whispered the ethics of Aristotle. Captive Greece, the poet Horace would later write, took captive her rough conqueror. Macedon had fallen, but its soul had migrated west. Picture that moment of ending the battlefield of Pydna, littered with broken spears and bronze helmets glinting in the dying light. A Roman centurion kneels beside a fallen Macedonian officer, turning the man's bronze coin between his fingers, a coin bearing the profile of Perseus, the proud descendant of Alexander. The centurion pockets it, unaware that he carries not a souvenir, but a symbol of inheritance. Through him, the Greek legacy would march onward, through Rome, through Byzantium, through every empire to follow. The Antagonids had ruled with dignity to the end, holding back the inevitable tide for as long as human will could resist time. Their fall marked not destruction, but transformation, the point at which Greece ceased to be a kingdom and became an idea. An idea once born cannot be conquered. The dust of Pydna had barely settled before Rome began to weave its web across the Greek world. At first, the victors called themselves protectors liberators of Hellas from tyranny, but the Greeks, seasoned in irony, knew what such words meant. Freedom declared by legions was freedom measured in obedience. The age of Greek dynasties of kings descending from gods of empires, born from philosophy and fire, was over. Yet Greece herself refused to die. She transformed. For in the ruins of monarchy, a subtler empire arose, one that conquered not by sword or law, but by thought. In 146 BCE, Corinth burned. Rome had grown weary of Greek uprisings and crushed the Achaean League, the last coalition that still dared to speak of independence. The city that had once dazzled with trade and bronze was plundered, its treasures carried off to Italy. On the same year, Carthage fell in the west, two civilizations, Greek and Punic, consumed in a single Roman gesture of dominance. But the conquerors did not salt Greece's soil as they did Carthage's. They could not. For Rome, Greece was not merely an enemy, it was a teacher. In the decades that followed, Greek culture flowed into Rome like wine into an unguarded cup. Senators decorated their villas with statues of Apollo and Athena. Roman children learned Homer before Latin poetry had yet matured. Greek tutors enslaved philosophers, grammarians, mathematicians, taught the sons of conquerors what civilization meant. The Stoic and the Epicurean, once thinkers of Athens and Corinth, became household names in the Forum. In this strange alchemy, the conquered became the architects of their conqueror's soul. The city of Athens, though politically irrelevant, found new life as a university of the ancient world. Students from across the empire came to walk beneath its olive trees and argue in its stoa. Plato's academy reopened not as a political force, but as a sanctuary of wisdom. The Lyceum of Aristotle, now a grove of scholars and scribes, preserved knowledge through meticulous copying. Philosophy replaced empire as Greece's new export. In marble halls and dusty courtyards, the eternal question of how one should live continued unbroken. Meanwhile, in the east remnants of the Hellenistic kingdoms lingered client states and semi-independent cities under Roman oversight. In Asia, minor Greek merchants still filled harbors. In Syria, the Greek language remained the lingua franca of commerce and law. Even the newly Romanized Egyptians still prayed in Greek to their queen goddess Isis. To be Greek was no longer a matter of blood, but of culture of participation in a shared mental world. Hellene had become an identity of the mind. Rome, pragmatic, as always, encouraged this. The Romans admired Greek beauty and intellect, even as they dismissed Greek politics as chaos. Their poets wrote of Athens with reverence, their generals spared its temples. When the Roman general Flamininus proclaimed at the Isthmian Games that Greece was free under Roman protection, the crowd cheered, though all understood the irony. To the Greeks, freedom had always been less a condition than a memory, something to be sung about, debated, longed for. Out of this new reality arose a hybrid civilization, Greco-Roman. In art, in architecture, in law, in the very rhythm of thought, the two worlds merged. Columns of Doric strength supported Roman basilicas. Myths of Zeus found Latin verses. The philosophy of Athens shaped the ethics of emperors. The old dynasties had vanished, but their ghosts were everywhere, haunting libraries, echoing in amphitheaters, whispering through marble mouths. And still the story was not done. From the coastal ruins of Asia Minor, new dynasties would emerge, client kings, raised in Greek education, loyal to Rome, but proud of their lineage. Among them, the Attalids of Pergamon shone briefly. They built altars and libraries to rival Alexandria's commissioning friezes that still pulse with life today. When their last king, Attalus III, died without an heir, he willed his kingdom to Rome. It was not conquest that brought his people under Roman rule, it was inheritance. Such was the final irony of Greek kingship, to die not in battle, but in bequest. By the dawn of the 1st century, BCE Greek dynasties survived only in Egypt, where the Ptolemies still sat on their fragile throne. Elsewhere, the descendants of Alexander's generals had been reduced to footnotes. Yet the civilization they had built was more alive than ever. In every Roman city stood a gymnasium modeled on the Greek. Every educated man quoted Plato and admired Aristotle. Even in religion, Greece's gods had found new names and homes. Apollo became Sol. Zeus found echoes in Jupiter. Dionysus danced beneath Roman stars. It is easy to mourn the loss of Greece's independence, to imagine her greatness ending with her kings. But history rarely ends so neatly. The Greek spirit did not vanish, it migrated. The democracy of Athens reappeared centuries later in Roman senates. The sculpture of Phidias lived on in Michelangelo's hands. The geometry of Euclid built cathedrals. In the end, Greece had achieved what no dynasty ever could: immortality without a throne. Far to the south, in the wide delta of the Nile, one dynasty still stood, brilliant, decadent, and doomed. The Ptolemies of Egypt, last of the Hellenistic monarchs, reigned over a kingdom of contradictions: Greek by intellect, Egyptian by soul, and Roman by necessity. Their capital, Alexandria, was the envy of the world, a city of marble avenues, fragrant gardens, and minds that never slept. Yet behind the polished facade, intrigue festered like rot beneath perfume. The line that began with Ptolemy the Southern Sota, Alexander's trusted companion, had stretched nearly 3 centuries. But by the 1st century BCE, its bloodline was as thin as the papyrus that carried its royal decrees. Each generation of Ptolemies had tried to preserve power through divine imagery and ruthless pragmatism. They married their siblings in imitation of the gods, claiming to embody Osiris and Isis reborn. The early kings had balanced the worship of the Egyptian priesthood with Greek rationalism, sponsoring the library and the Museion, the temples and the astronomers. But by the time of Ptolemy Auletes, the flute player, the dynasty had become a parody of its former self. The treasury was empty, the army unreliable, and Rome, now mistress of the Mediterranean, watched Egypt like a hawk, studying prey, too beautiful to ignore. Into this gilded decay was born Cleopatra VII. Philopator, the last and perhaps the most extraordinary of all Greek monarchs. Her name has echoed through centuries like the rustle of silk in candlelight, but behind the legend stood a mind of rare precision. Fluent in 9 languages, trained in mathematics, philosophy, and statecraft, Cleopatra was the culmination of Greek intellect and Egyptian mystique. She could speak to scholars as easily as to soldiers charm senators or debate priests in their own tongue. The gods of 2 worlds seem to have conspired in her creation. When she ascended the throne in 51 BCE, Egypt was already a client state in all but name. Her father's debts to Rome had crippled the kingdom. Its future hung on diplomacy. Cleopatra's first years were a blur of family betrayal and civil war. Her brother Ptolemy III conspired against her. Armies clashed along the Nile. Into this turmoil stepped a figure whose ambition mirrored her own, Gaius Julius Caesar. When he arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey, he found the city burning with factional hatred. Legend says Cleopatra, forbidden to meet him, had herself smuggled into the royal palace, rolled inside a carpet. When the carpet unfurled, and she stood before Caesar, unarmed and unafraid, history itself seemed to pause for breath. Their alliance was immediate, pragmatic, and profound. Cleopatra needed Roman protection to secure her throne. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth to finance his own wars. Together, they restored order, defeating her brother's forces in a battle fought upon the Nile's shimmering waters. The city cheered her return. The priests hailed her as goddess. Caesar, ever the strategist, lingered longer than prudence allowed. Their son Caesarion, Little Caesar, was the living symbol of a world momentarily balanced between 2 civilizations. Under Cleopatra's rule, Egypt revived. Trade flowed once more through the Red Sea, the temples thrived, and scholars returned to Alexandria. She portrayed herself as the living Isis, but also as a Greek philosopher queen. In her presence, the ideals of Athens and the mysticism of Thebes reconciled for the last time. The Ptolemaic dream, the synthesis of East and West, flared again briefly, like a dying star burning brighter just before its end. But Rome, ever restless, could not tolerate equals. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's protector was gone. In his place rose 2 men, Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's general and his heir. Once allies, they soon turned rivals, dividing the empire between them. Cleopatra, discerning Antony's passion and ambition, allied herself with him. Their partnership was both strategic and legendary, a union of 2 brilliant, flawed souls who mistook power for permanence. Together, they ruled the Eastern Mediterranean, like gods reborn Antony as Dionysus, Cleopatra as Isis. For a decade, they held their world together. Yet in Rome, Octavian spun a different tale, of an Egyptian seductress ensnaring a Roman hero of the East corrupting the West. When Antony divorced Octavian's sister to marry Cleopatra, the propaganda turned lethal. Rome demanded vengeance. In 31 BCE at Actium, their fleets met for the final reckoning. The wind betrayed them. Cleopatra, seeing the tide turn, fled with her ships. Antony followed. The battle was lost, their empire shattered. Within a year, Octavian marched into Egypt. Antony, cornered, fell upon his sword in despair. Cleopatra, refusing humiliation, chose her own death, whether by poison or asp, none can say. She died as she had lived, deliberate, theatrical, and entirely her own. With her passing, the line of the Ptolemies ended, and with it, the age of all Greek dynasties. Octavian took her treasures, her throne, and her son's life. Egypt became a Roman province, its gods reduced to curiosities, its temples to tourist shrines. Yet Cleopatra's legend would outlast every conqueror who followed. For centuries, poets and painters would see in her the ghost of Greece's last defiance, the final shimmer of a civilization that refused to fade quietly. In that moment, as the last queen lay in her gilded chamber surrounded by silence and incense, the story of Greek rule came full circle. From the Mycenaean kings to Alexander's heirs, from Solon's laws to Pericles' marble, from Sparta's iron to Egypt's gold, all of it ended in a single sigh along the Nile. But endings, as Greece had always taught, are merely transformations. The death of Cleopatra marked more than the end of a dynasty. It marked the sunset of an age. With her passing, the ancient lineage of Greek kings and queens that had stretched from the dawn of the Bronze Age to the splendor of Alexander's heirs slipped quietly into memory. The torch passed fully to Rome, whose legions and laws would command the Mediterranean for centuries. Yet even in Rome's triumph, Greece endured, not in crowns or armies, but in the architecture of the mind. The conquerors ruled the world, but the conquered ruled the conqueror's imagination. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, walked through the silent halls of Alexandria in 30 BCE and found not resistance, but history. The marble libraries were still, the scholars subdued, the harbor filled with the wrecks of ships that had once carried the ambitions of Antony and Cleopatra. Yet Augustus, coldly pragmatic, understood what his predecessors had not, that Greece was not a rival to be destroyed, but a jewel to be worn. He declared Egypt his personal province, its grain, the lifeblood of Rome, its culture, a living museum. The Greek scholars who survived the purge were sent to teach in Rome, the astronomers to serve the calendar, the architects to adorn the empire's new marble skin. In time, Greece itself was absorbed peacefully. The cities of Hellas became provincial centers. Athens, Corinth, Delphi, and Olympia, all stripped of political power, yet filled with reverence. Roman nobles made pilgrimages there, as students once had to the temples of learning. The philosopher's robe replaced the general's armor as the new mark of Greek prestige. The Academy of Plato and the Lyceum of Aristotle continued to echo with debate, but their questions shifted from politics and virtue to metaphysics and eternity. Greece had ceased to lead, yet it refused to vanish. Its ideas began to breathe through new lungs. For the Romans, Greek wisdom became a kind of inheritance. Cicero modeled his oratory on Demosthenes. Virgil patterned his Aeneid on Homer's Odyssey. Roman sculptors copied Athenian marbles until imitation became devotion. Greek tutors raised the sons of senators, and in their lessons, the ideals of arete excellence, disciplined beauty, passed quietly into Roman virtue. The empire itself, vast and multilingual, spoke Latin in its laws but thought in Greek. In the East, the Greek tongue remained so dominant that even Roman emperors addressed their subjects in it. The language of Aristotle became the lingua franca of the civilized world. The ancient dynasties, though long dead, seemed to whisper through the empire's palaces. Augustus styled himself a new Alexander, his statues carved in the heroic nudity of Greek art. Temples to Zeus were rededicated to Jupiter. Statues of Athena were rechristened Minerva, yet their faces remained the same. Even the city of Rome, that stern republic reborn as monarchy, remade itself in Greek marble, its theatres, baths, and forums echoing the geometry of Athens. When Rome sought immortality, it borrowed the Greek design for it, and so began the long afterlife of Hellenism, the slow diffusion of Greek civilization into the bloodstream of humanity. From Alexandria's scholars came the geometry that built aqueducts and cathedrals. From the Stoics of Athens came the ethics that shaped Roman law and Christian philosophy alike. The gods faded, but their symbols endured. The myths were retold in new tongues. The dynasties had ruled with bronze and blood, but their true legacy, ideas, art inquiry, could not be conquered. During the first centuries of Roman rule, Greece became what it had always secretly longed to be: eternal. No longer consumed by civil war or tyranny, her cities turned inward to preservation. Monuments were restored, temples maintained, festivals revived. Even emperors visited to pay homage. Nero, mad and vain, still paused to perform music at Olympia. Hadrian, philosopher and builder, rebuilt Athens with libraries, arches, and baths. The Parthenon, scarred but standing, received new offerings from men who now ruled a world Alexander could scarcely have imagined. Across the empire, Greek influence rippled. In Syria, Greek philosophers debated beneath Roman mosaics. In Anatolia, temples dedicated to Zeus now bore Latin inscriptions. In Egypt, Greek mathematicians wrote treatises that would one day reach the scholars of Baghdad. The old dynastic centers, Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon, became crossroads of the known world, their theaters filled with Roman elites quoting Euripides. The names of Ptolemy and Seleucus Antigonus and Pericles became more than history, they became vocabulary. Yet there was melancholy beneath the grandeur. The Greeks had once believed that man could become like the gods. Now they worshipped emperors who pretended to be divine. The age of philosophers had yielded to that of administrators. But perhaps that too was a form of continuity. The Greeks had taught the world that no idea dies, it merely changes form. Their dynasties had collapsed, yes, but their worldview had colonized the human spirit. Picture then the world around the 1st century CE, a Roman soldier marching through Judea with a copy of Homer in his pack. A Greek architect in Ephesus sketching designs for a temple that will soon bear a Latin name. An Egyptian scholar in Alexandria measuring the stars using equations born in Athens. Across continents, across centuries, the hum of Greek thought persists, a soft music beneath the noise of empire. Centuries passed, and the marble of Greece began to weather, yet her spirit only deepened like the lines on an ancient philosopher's face, wiser with time. Rome's empire grew and fractured. Emperors came and went. Yet through every transformation, Greek thought remained the unspoken grammar of civilization. The dynasties had vanished, but their language, the rhythm of reason, beauty, and proportion, survived, flowing silently beneath new empires, like an underground river that never forgot its source. By the 2nd century, CE, the world of the Greeks, had been remade into the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and yet, paradoxically, it looked more Greek than ever. The eastern half of the empire, from Macedonia through Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, spoke Greek, prayed in Greek, and dreamed in Greek myths. When the Emperor Hadrian visited Athens, he wept at its faded glory and then restored it with marble and gold. He built libraries, baths, and temples. He completed the temple of Olympian Zeus that had been left unfinished for centuries. For him and for many Romans, Greece was no longer a province. It was the conscience of the empire. Hadrian's successor, Marcus Aurelius, wrote his meditations not in Latin but in Greek, a language he considered more precise for the language of the soul. From his imperial tent along the Danube, he filled his journals with stoic reflections that echoed the lessons of Zeno and Cleanthes. Accept everything that happens as necessary. Act justly. Speak truthfully. A Greek philosophy written by a Roman emperor for a humanity that was slowly becoming one. The line between ruler and thinker, between conqueror and philosopher, had blurred an echo, perhaps, of the harmony Greece had always sought between power and wisdom. Yet even as philosophy flourished, the gods began to fade. Across the Aegean, the old temples still glittered in the sun, but their altars grew cold. The new faith, rising in the East, Christianity, spread quietly through the Greek-speaking world, carried not by kings, but by fishermen, slaves, and scholars. Its scriptures were written in Greek, its theology debated in the same language that had once birthed Socratic dialogue. In a strange twist of fate, the tongue of Zeus and Aristotle now gave voice to a single God and his incarnate word. The logos of Heraclitus became the word of John. The Greek world, always searching for meaning, had found a new one. The great cities of the Hellenistic age adapted. Alexandria became the crossroads of theology, where Jewish, Christian, and pagan scholars argued beneath the shadow of the lighthouse. Antioch turned into a center of early Christian leadership. Ephesus housed councils that defined doctrine. Even Athens, proud and pagan, became a place of conversion, its philosophers slowly giving way to bishops. The gods of Olympus retreated into poetry and metaphor, but the love of argument and the quest for truth survived, now baptized rather than banished. The transformation of Greek legacy into Christian civilization was not erasure, it was evolution. The dynasties of flesh and blood had passed, but the dynasty of spirit continued. The Greek impulse to seek the divine through reason found a new form in theology. The Greek love of beauty found new expression in mosaics and hymns. The early church fathers, Origen Basil, Gregory, and Chrysostom, were heirs of Plato as much as of Christ. Their sermons were dialogues, their cathedrals geometries of heaven. When Constantine the Great shifted the empire's capital eastward in the 4th century CE, he did not choose Rome. He chose Byzantium, a Greek city reborn as Constantinople. There, on the straits between Europe and Asia, rose the new Rome, a city that looked westward in empire, but eastward in soul. Greek became its official tongue, Greek culture its pulse. The empire of law had transformed into an empire of faith, but its foundations remained the same marble laid by Athenian minds. Through Byzantium, the Greek dynasties found an unexpected resurrection. The emperors called themselves basileis, a word echoing Homeric kingship. They ruled not from divine lineage, but from divine right, crowned beneath mosaics of Christ Pantocrator. Their bureaucracy was Roman, but their literature, art, and philosophy were pure Hellenic continuity. The libraries of Constantinople became the final guardians of Greek knowledge, preserving Aristotle, Euclid, and Herodotus through the coming darkness that would swallow much of Europe. And so, centuries after Alexander's empire had shattered, a new Greek empire stood, Christian, imperial, and eternal. The Byzantine emperors, from Justinian to Basil II, carried forward the invisible crown of Hellenism. In their courts, scholars debated not only scripture, but astronomy, medicine, and geometry. In their cathedrals, domes rose like marble heavens, a geometry of devotion. The dynasties of Greece had transformed from the rule of men to the reign of ideas, then to the governance of spirit. Imagine Constantinople at dawn in the 6th century, the call of gulls over the Golden Horn, the hum of monks chanting in Greek, the sun striking the dome of Hagia Sophia until it seems to float in midair. Within those walls, Justinian rules, not as a Macedonian or a Roman, but as a synthesis of both. Around him, scholars copy Plato and codify Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation of Western jurisprudence. The world has changed, yet the mind guiding it remains unmistakably Greek, from Mycenae to Macedon, from Athens to Byzantium. Greece had traveled through every form of dynasty, blood law, art, and spirit. Her kings had perished, her philosophers had endured. And though the Parthenon's columns had cracked and the old gods had fallen silent, the Greek world had achieved what no dynasty of stone ever could. It had become the architecture of thought itself. Byzantium, heir to the long Greek continuum, shimmered like a mirage between worlds, half ancient, half medieval, yet unmistakably Hellenic beneath its golden mosaics. From its founding in 330 CE to its final twilight, 1,000 years later, it preserved what all earlier dynasties had lost: continuity. The emperors of Constantinople ruled longer than any line of kings before them, not by the sword alone, but through ceremony, scholarship, and faith. They were the living bridge between Pericles' marble and Christ's heaven, philosopher kings in purple robes. Justinian I stood at the empire's zenith. In the 6th century, he sought to reunite the Roman world under Greek intelligence. His generals Belisarius and Narses reconquered Italy and North Africa, while at home he raised the most exquisite monument of Christian antiquity, the Hagia Sophia. Its vast dome floating on light was the last architectural echo of the Parthenon's harmony transfigured into devotion. Inside the language of the liturgy was Greek. Its rhythms carried the cadence of Homer's verse. Justinian's law code, drawn from Roman precedent, yet clarified by Greek logic, became the skeleton of European jurisprudence. If the old dynasties had built walls and temples, Justinian built order itself. After him, Byzantium endured through centuries of peril. Waves of Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Turks battered its frontiers, but within the walls of Constantinople, the libraries never closed. Monks in glittering scriptoria copied Aristotle and Euclid, preserving the ancient world line by line while the West forgot it. Greek fire, that alchemical weapon guarding the Bosporus, burned enemy fleets. Greek wisdom guarded civilization. The empire might shrink and bleed, yet its spirit refused extinction. Its rulers, Heraclius Basil II, the Komnenoi, governed through ritual as intricate as geometry. Every act of coronation, every chant in the palace chapel, was a conscious echo of classical form. The emperors styled themselves autocratores Romaion, emperors of the Romans, but in truth, they were the last Hellenes. They spoke Greek, dreamed in Plato's symmetry, prayed with the fervor of Orpheus reborn. To the peasants of Anatolia, they were defenders of the faith. To scholars in their capitals, they were custodians of reason. Through Byzantium, the old Greek habit of synthesis, the joining of opposites, reached perfection. Pagan geometry merged with Christian mysticism. Philosophy intertwined with theology. The art of debate fused with the art of prayer. The mosaics of the era show faces calm and frontal eyes wide with eternity. They are neither gods nor men, but thought itself made flesh. In this serene abstraction, one feels the final evolution of the Greek search for harmony, the same desire that had once shaped the Doryphoros and the dialogues of Plato. Yet the world around Byzantium changed faster than it could adapt. In the West, Latin had hardened into new tongues. In the East, Islam rose with the vigor of youth. Greek civilization, the quiet scholar between empires, taught even its rivals. Arab philosophers studied Aristotle through Syriac and Greek translations. Persian astronomers used Alexandrian tables to map the heavens. The dynasty of the mind had become global. By the 12th century, Constantinople was a mosaic of contradictions, monks debating metaphysics beside merchants, counting silver philosophers, quoting Homer, while the call to prayer drifted from distant minarets. When the Crusaders came in 1204, they did not liberate the Holy Land, but plundered the Queen of Cities. For 3 bitter generations, the empire was scattered, its relics sold, its icons shattered. Yet even exile could not extinguish Hellenism. The scholars who fled west carried their manuscripts into Italy, sowing the first seeds of the Renaissance. The words of Plato and the sketches of ancient artists slept in monastic trunks until Florence awoke them. Thus, the ashes of Byzantium fertilized Europe's rebirth. The restored empire of the Palaiologoi in the 14th century was a ghost of its former self, small pore, yet luminous. Its scholars still debated Aristotle beneath cracked domes. Its artists perfected the serene light of icons. While cannons thundered beyond the walls, scribes hurried to finish their copies of Homer and Ptolemy. In 1453, when Mehmed II breached the city's walls, the last emperor, Constantine IV, fought and vanished in the melee, an echo of Leonidas at Thermopylae. The torch of Greece passed once more now eastward into the Ottoman courts and westward into Renaissance Europe. For a moment, the world was silent. The city that had once been the mind of civilization was now smoke and rubble. But through that silence drifted the unbroken whisper of Greek words, prayers, poems, equations carried by refugees to Venice, Rome, and beyond. The dynasties of Greece, from Agamemnon to the Palaiologoi, had all fallen, yet each collapse had scattered seeds of rebirth. The story of the Greek dynasties reaches its final horizon, not an ending, but a dispersal, a scattering of embers that continue to glow wherever thought itself takes root. From the marble palaces of Mycenae to the golden domes of Constantinople, the tale winds through nearly 3,000 years of kings, philosophers, warriors, and dreamers. What began as fragile city kingdoms on rocky coasts ended as a civilization diffused through every language, every art, every law. The bodies of empires perished, but the mind of Greece never died. After the fall of Byzantium, the Renaissance of the West became Greece reborn in another tongue. Italian painters studied anatomy through the eyes of Polykleitos and drew perspective with Euclid's precision. Scholars like Bessarion and Plethon fugitives from Constantinople carried manuscripts across the Adriatic. In Florence, the Platonic Academy revived under new patrons. In Venice, presses printed Aristotle for the first time in centuries. Western Europe believed itself rediscovering the ancient world, but it was Greece rediscovering itself through new hands. In mathematics and science, the lineage continued. Copernicus built his heliocentric universe upon the geometry of Ptolemy, even as he overturned it. Kepler traced his ellipses through the language of Archimedes. Newton later confessed that he had stood on the shoulders of giants, and many of those giants bore Greek names. Medicine traced its oaths to Hippocrates, politics, its vocabulary to Athens, and logic, its very syntax to Aristotle. Even the words democracy, philosophy, cosmos, and idea whispered of a homeland older than memory. And in art, the Greeks lived again. Michelangelo's David stood not as a Christian saint, but as an echo of the heroic nude and air of Doryphoros. Renaissance theaters staged tragedies based on Sophocles and Euripides. Baroque cathedrals borrowed their harmony from the Parthenon's columns. The dialogue between pagan beauty and Christian devotion that had begun in Byzantium now reached its crescendo in the West. Every brushstroke, every stanza, every theorem bore the unseen fingerprint of Hellas. Meanwhile, in the lands once ruled by Alexander, the Greek spirit endured in quieter forms. In the monasteries of Mount Athos, monks still chanted in the language of Homer, preserving not only scripture, but syntax itself. In the Ottoman courts, Greek scholars served as physicians' translators and diplomats, the living arteries of classical learning in an Islamic world that revered Aristotle as the first teacher. And in the far reaches of Persia and India, fragments of Greek astronomy and medicine continued to circulate like ancient pollen, invisible yet fertile. When modern Greece finally reawakened in the 19th century, its revolution against Ottoman rule was fought not only with muskets, but with memory. The freedom sought by the insurgents was not merely political, it was ancestral. They saw themselves as heirs of Leonidas and Pericles of Alexander and Constantine. Lord Byron, the English poet who died for their cause, called Greece the land of lost gods and marble dreams. Yet those dreams proved durable. The new Greek state rose up on the bones of the old, a small nation carrying an immortal inheritance. And beyond politics, the Greek dynasties lived on as myth woven into the identity of the entire modern world. The Enlightenment's philosophers, the scientists of the industrial age, even the astronauts, who later named the craters of the moon after Greek thinkers, all moved through a cosmos that the Greeks had first imagined. The temples might have crumbled, but the proportions of their stones informed every city skyline built since. The dramas of Aeschylus became the DNA of Western storytelling. Democracy's fragile promise, tested again and again, still follows Solon's design. To trace this lineage is to realize that Greece was never one nation, nor even one era. It was an unfolding conversation between chaos and order, between mortal and divine, between freedom and fate. Its dynasties, whether carved in bronze or ink, each added a verse to the same epic, the belief that human beings could shape meaning out of mystery. From the Bacchiads of Corinth to the Ptolemies of Egypt, from the lawgivers to the dreamers, every ruler and reformer carried the same quiet conviction that civilization itself was the true heirloom. Across millennia, the Greeks achieved what all dynasties secretly desire: immortality without bloodline. Their empires vanished, but their questions remain. How should we live? What is justice? What is beauty? What is the soul? Every time those questions are asked in a courtroom, a classroom, a telescope's eye, Greece is speaking again. Now let your mind rest upon that long horizon. Imagine the Aegean at night islands like dark jewels scattered on a sea of starlight. Somewhere, perhaps a fisherman hums an old melody descended from an ode to Apollo. Somewhere, a child reads the alphabet first invented on those same shores. The waves lap against the stones that once held the footsteps of kings. The air smells of salt and time, timeless and tender,